June 30, 2016 ATB, Shinjuku Ghetto, Tokyo Settlement. 1015. The sun beat down, the scorching heat undiminished by the tepid breeze rolling off the distant waters of Sagami Bay. Noon was still an hour and a half away and the true heat of the day wouldn't come until 2 hours after that, but it was already unbearable. Spring, I decided, is well and truly dead. At the very least, I could take solace in the fact that, as the de facto ruler of Shinjuku Ghetto, nobody expected me to haul chunks of broken concrete and twisted rebar to waiting wheelbarrows, as I had done in past summers. Indeed, using my authority, I had done my best to ensure that nobody else was expected to do likewise. All above-ground work had moved to a nocturnal schedule, to the rejoicing of all the work crews toiling within the encircling wall. There were complaints, of course. No matter how universally approved any given decision might be, there would always be complaints. I was sadly aware that their presence was something of a fundamental axiom of society. There was no such thing as 100% approval rating, not so long as those surveyed were free to speak and their words were accurately recorded. Mr. Nishizumi Tsutsumi, the source of many of those complaints, had managed to draw me out of the coolness of the Rising Sun headquarters basement before the evening hours, out into the unrelenting heat. Mr. Nishizumi, or more properly, Councillor Nishizumi, represented almost a third of the northwestern district of Kamiyakiai on the Council of Notables, the governing organ Naoto had set up to help him handle the management of Shinjuku. Since the elder Kozuki had left for the countryside, that group had rapidly become my personal nemesis. Of course, if I were being honest, I really only had myself to blame for that particular metamorphosis. There he is, I think, Masatsugu, the leader of today's three-man security detail, said. Looks like he's got 4 others with him. Any of them armed? The question was mostly pro forma. Of course Nishizumi would have armed bodyguards. Shinjuku had become drastically safer once the Rising Sun took full control over the entire ghetto, but nobody with property worth stealing would wander around unarmed given any other option. As a councillor, Nishizumi both had access to enough supplies to make him a potential target and, thanks to my attempt to garner legitimacy, no shortage of people willing to carry arms for him. Yeah, came the laconic reply. I think 2 of them that I can see. They just have bats, though. Old baseball bats on their shoulders. The rest could have knives or whatever. You never really know. You never really do, I agreed, and winced at how tired I sounded. I would have to do a better job at injecting energy in my voice once I got within earshot of the councillor. The man was a politician and would have no qualms about leveraging any perceived weakness. Let's go say hello to the fine notable, shall we? As it turned out, the first greeting came from the Kamiyakiai contingent. Commander. Welcome to our little slice of heaven. The councillor's greeting boomed out into the street, empty under the baking sun save for our respective parties. According to Nagata, Nishizumi Tsutsumi had been part of Japan's merchant marine before the conquest. The ex-sailor clearly hadn't lost any of his capacity for leather-lunched bellowing over the 6 years he had spent away from the sea. It's damn hot today, isn't it? Truly an excellent reason to spend the next hour in the meeting house's basement, I agreed, returning his quick bow with an abbreviated bob of my own, running my eyes over his party. The 2 openly armed men both wore sun-guard hakamaki and presumably were members of the militia unit drawn from Nishizumi's constituency. Nominally, they were just as much my men as my security detail. Nominally. So why are we still out here on this street instead of making our way inside? Hey, Councillor Nishizumi, a deeply tanned man in his late 30s sporting a prematurely grey beard, replied with a joviality that rang false in my ears, nothing wrong with the street. The boys have done a fine job with the repaving work. The former merchantman paused, before adding, send my congratulations to young Kozuki, will you? I'm sure he'd be delighted to hear from you, Councillor, as always. Deciding not to stand on ceremony as I traded barbs with the man, I swept past him and continued on my way towards the newest Rising Sun meeting house, located only a few blocks away. You might be happy to hear that I was, in fact, the one who ensured the repaving crews reached as far to the north as Kamiyakiai. As such, I am very pleased to hear that you like the new roads. The notable was only a pace behind me, following me just as I had known he would. Behind us, his party, his 2 militiamen, an aide, and a boy a few years older than me who I assumed to be a message runner, fell into step behind my two trailing guards. A petty power play, admittedly, but so had Councillor Nishizumi's choice of meeting location. We could have met in the shadowy interior of the meeting hall, but that would have started the meeting in my territory. As if this entire city isn't my territory, I thought with a repressed sneer. Some days, it feels like this city and its people are merely the notables to toy with, to hold hostage to their whims, for all that they acknowledge my position. I swore that I would fight for an independent Japan. I didn't swear that I'd recreate the Republic of Japan in all of its maladaptive oligarchic glory. Long ago, in a different life, I had read a line somewhere about how gratitude was the currency with the shortest half-life. Nothing I had seen from the Council of Notables in the 2 months since I had taken responsibility for Shinjuku and all those who dwelled within it had disproved that forgotten author's assertion. The gifts I had given and the privileges I had extended had turned into entitlements and sacred rights with remarkable speed. Those first few weeks, when the first and second shipments from Kyoto arrived, had been the good times. From that high watermark of cordial relations, my relationship with the Council of Notables had slowly degraded. Their willingness to cooperate had dwindled as the supplies allotted to their districts from the Rising Sun's stockpiles diminished, as had my willingness to tolerate their incessant wheedling. I still didn't think that I had made a mistake when I had given the Council of Notables control over their home detachments of the Sun Guard. In a way, I had just formalized the current situation, while spinning the facts to suit the narrative that I was in full control of Shinjuku. The notables had been elected to the council by the votes of electors, who were in turn nominated by the various tenements, blocks, and streets within each district. The notables, therefore, were the local magnates, those with sufficient resources or influence to convince or cozen their district electors to vote for them. They were the people who the young men and women who made up the militia would naturally go to for orders or for help. By recasting their de facto control of their people as the result of procedures and consensus beyond my decisions instead of the usual outcome of the human tendency to form hierarchies, I had turned that potential vulnerability into a tangible sign that I wasn't a power-hungry lunatic eager to consolidate power in my own hands. That I was having enough trouble managing my responsibilities as it was without any further consolidation of power was not something I felt the need to share with the Council of Notables. They expected me to seize every scrap of power I could and had prepared to dig in to resist my encroachment once Naoto named me the authority in Shinjuku. They had told each other that my Britannian blood in tender years would make it inevitable that I'd go mad with power, that I'd prove myself just a gangster who had somehow manipulated the soft-hearted Naoto. They didn't understand me, nor did they understand Naoto. Anybody who thought the elder Kozuki was soft-hearted was a fool. He was simply strong and wise enough to show mercy when he could and should. In truth, I envied his skill at diplomacy and political maneuver. Similarly, they misunderstood me. I had no desire to fight the notables for power, and so, to their vast surprise, I had simply given it to them, a gift instead of a contest. Entrusting the notables with their Sun Guard units outside of times of emergency had been the clearest way I could signal that the Rising Sun wasn't just a gang and I had no desire to be a king. At the time, I had been hoping that such a clear signal, coupled with the free distribution of the food I had purchased with gang money, would lead to mutual cooperation and understanding. For a while, it had. Then, the first notable had turned down my request to use their Sun Guard as a labor force for a specific project in another district. Another would only agree to a similar request if their district got an extra meal every day for a week, which would have decreased the amount available in all other districts. Battle lines were drawn in the council. Past that point, the rot of factionalism had begun to bite in earnest. It would have been easy, so easy, to force a solution to this problem. The Rising Sun maintained its monopoly on coil guns and ammunition, radios and medicine, and most crucially, over the majority of the stockpiles of food, clothes, and construction materials. The Council of Notables was riven with internal divisions, and while most continuously connived, a distinct minority were loyalists who never asked for more or quibbled when I requested the use of their young people for the greater good of Shinjuku. It would have been the Britannian thing to do. Realizing that had been enough to show me the trap that temptation represented. Even with the best of intentions, coercing support from the people of Shinjuku would forever contaminate the public relations well and tarnish my name. I would set myself and my organizations apart as yet another oppressor in a line of oppressors, come to take and take. Once I crossed that line, even to guarantee unity among the governors of Shinjuku, it would be easier to cross it again in the future. And once I reached that point, I might as well start dressing like a Britannian, because that's what I would be. With that nightmare scenario in mind, I had set myself to a task I was ill-equipped for and heartily disliked, playing politics. Which isn't even part of my brief. That was Naoto's job, his and Ogi's, to a lesser extent. The whining was just as self-serving as any of the endless complaints from the council, but in the private sanctuary of my mind, I had little compunction about delving into selfishness. So, Councillor Nishizumi, I began, slowing slightly to walk beside the man instead of a pace ahead. What was it exactly that you wanted to inspect at the meeting house? Your man, the sailor-turned-politician began, is being a real pain in my ass, Commander. He just came in here, took over the old post office, and started throwing his weight around. Considering how much crap your boys hauled inside, he must be sitting on a whole mountain of resources. As the counselor for Central Kamiakai, I want to see what he's hoarding. By the end of his miniature rant, Nishizumi was practically spitting the words out. The last word, in particular, was like a curse in his mouth, and it was hard not to wince at the accusation. Given how desperate everyone was in the wake of the conquest, even the mere accusation of hoarding was a matter taken very, very seriously in Shinjuku, both back before the rising sun had established hegemony and after. I can see that you are quite concerned about this matter, I began, trying to remember how Naoto had spoken to the councillors on the handful of times I'd accompanied him to meetings, but that doesn't sound like the Nagata Takeshi I know. I trust him and Kozuki Naoto trusts him, they've known one another for years. After all, I doubt he'd throw all of that away just to put the screws to you, Councillor Nishizumi. To my irritation, only the reminder that Naoto trusted Nagata dented the notable's hostile expression even slightly. Even good men can have bad friends, Nishizumi rebutted, thankfully lapsing into silence as we approached the Kamiakai Rising Sun meeting house, where Nagata stood waiting by the door for us. It was immediately obvious that there was no love lost between the two men. Nagata, I said, stepping out ahead of Councillor Nishizumi and greeting my lieutenant, thank you for agreeing to meet with us today. I'm sure you're quite busy as it is. Commander, he acknowledged, and I tried not to wince at the title someone in the Rising Sun had slapped onto me. I suspected Ino was the responsible party, judging by the way her lips twitched whenever someone used the title in her earshot. I'm always happy to make time for you. I hope the trip all the way out here wasn't too bad? A little heat won't stop me, I replied, full of false heartiness, which fell away as I continued. Especially considering the concerns Councillor Nishizumi has raised. Concerns, eh? Judging by the way the councillor's lips twitched, he had clearly intended to punctuate the sentence with a gob of spit but had thought better of it at the last moment. Yeah, I've got some concerns, if that's how you want to put it. Commander, his voice rose, full of belligerent certainty. Like I said, your man here is a hoarder. He's skimming off the top of the distribution for my district, for Central Kamiakai, and keeping it squirreled away for his own use. Believe me. I certainly believe that I've heard you say all that and more, I coolly replied, turning to look up at the former sailor, who stood a solid 2 heads taller than me. Indeed, I believe that's why I'm out here this bright and sunny morning. I have heard your concerns and shared them with Nagata here. We three will inspect the measuring devices and the stores here at the Kamiakai meeting house and hopefully put your mind at ease in the process. Right, Nishizumi nodded curtly, his temper, for the moment, back under control. And in the interest of fairness and transparency and such, you won't mind if my man-chan here, he hooked a finger over at the skinny man I had apparently correctly identified as his aide, tags along as a witness, right? Well, I said, smiling blandly up at the man, I can certainly respect your love of transparency, Councillor Nishizumi, and fairness also. So, in the name of fairness, I think Nagata should be allowed to bring along a witness of his own, wouldn't you agree? Before the notable could protest, I turned to Nagata. Nagata? Would you kindly find us a witness and lead us to the distribution room, or wherever you're keeping the cups and the scales? Let's hurry up and get on with this. That conversation more or less set the pace for the next hour and a half. As Masatsugu and my other two guards cooled their heels in the meeting house's dining room in the company of Nishizumi's two guards and his messenger, I did my best to keep the peace between Nagata and Nishizumi as we examined the cups used to dole out rice and flour, the scales that weighed the measure of biscuit, and the larders that provided for the thrice-weekly communal meals. Throughout the entire ordeal, Nishizumi took every chance he could to snipe at Nagata. The usually quiet and mild-mannered Kozuki organization member was uncharacteristically giving back just as much as he got, once even snarling at the counselor in reply to some snide comment or another. While the root of their tension was still unknown to me, it was clearly a deeply personal and mutual resentment they shared. Annoyingly, this was a situation that could have been avoided had I spent more time with the individual counselors before or, for that matter, if I'd shared more one-on-one time with Nagata in the last several months. In my defense, I had been busy and Nagata had fully capitalized on his return to Shinjuku to spend as much time as he could with his wife and little daughter, Ami and Yukari respectively, and before he had left Naoto had done a fine job managing the council. But perhaps if I had shown more interest in the lives of my subordinates and in a network of social grudges and alliances in the Council of Notables, this whole situation could have been avoided. It was an unhelpful thought, self-castigating and based on speculation about the hypotheticals. Yes, it would have been helpful to know that Nagata had a long-standing grudge against the man who represented a third of the Kamiyaki district before I had put him in charge of the new meeting house distribution point in that area. Yes, perhaps I should have asked the three councillors who represented the district for their input on the meeting house and its staff. But what was done is done, and I was thoroughly sick of trying to manage the pair of them. But, while neither Nagata nor Nishizumi had endeared themselves to me lately, it rapidly became apparent that Nishizumi had no evidence of any embezzlement from the Rising Sun supplies on Nagata's part beyond vague claims about what everyone knows, nor did the inspection of the measuring devices find any indications of tampering. "You saw it yourself, Counselor," I said, trying to keep my tone level and my frustration off my face. We looked all around the meeting hall. Every room was made available for your inspection. No signs of any hoarded supplies, no signs of rigged cups or unfair scales. Unless there's some further evidence you can supply, I will insist that you recant your accusations against Nagata. Like hell I will. The former merchantman's stentorian was deafeningly loud in the lobby of the post office turned Rising Sun building. Mark my words, Commander, that man is a slippery little shit. He's stealing from you, he's stealing from me, and more importantly he's stealing from my people. Don't blame me for your own failures, Counselor. Nagata retorted, his face an ugly mess of blotchy spots, his fists tightly clenched at his sides. Just because you can't keep your own house in order doesn't mean I'm sabotaging you. Unlike some people I could mention, I don't need to stoop to gangsterism to earn respect. You little shit. At Counselor Nishizumi's bellow of rage, I took the opportunity to physically step between the two men, forcing them to separate or shove me aside. Enough. I barked, all but snarling with barely contained frustration. The voice of authority, honed on the Prussian parade grounds and Alsatian battlefields, effortlessly cut through the chaos of the argument like shrapnel through a teenaged draftee. For a moment I stared down both men, cowing them into silence with the unspoken weight of my displeasure. The armed members of my security detail looming behind me were an unnecessary afterthought as the two squabblers fell silent, neither able to maintain eye contact with me. Nagata, I said, starting with my old ally and friend. The ex-plumber's arms immediately snapped to his sides as he stood at attention, the lessons from the school making themselves known. The Rising Sun never lacks work for idle hands. Kindly take this opportunity to start working on preparing your staff for the next distribution. Handling those matters is your responsibility, I will handle things here. For a moment, I saw defiance flicker in my subordinate as his eyes darted to the notable beside me, almost aglow with simmering rage. Thankfully, that rage wasn't quite enough to make Nagata forget himself. He took a breath, held it, and let it go. Yes, Commander. Nishizumi looked like he was going to make a parting crack as Nagata left, but thankfully he caught my quelling look and kept his mouth shut. For now, at least. Counselor Nishizumi, I began again, my voice not nearly as level as I would have liked. I understand that you have personal business with Nagata, and I understand your commendable dedication to the welfare of your district. However, unless you have evidence that he has actually committed some wrong against you or yours, I insist that you cease making accusations against him." Before the inevitable angry rejoinder could come, I continued in a more conciliatory tone. "I won't ask for an apology, as that seems like a bridge too far. And, if you can actually provide evidence," I spread my hands, as if I was accepting something from him, "I would be more than happy to see it. I think we can all agree that while we struggle under the boot of Britannian oppression, betraying each other for greed and selfishness is among the most intolerable of crimes." "And you don't like Nagata? Fine. He is a valued friend of Naoto's, but I won't force everyone to bow and scrape to him just because of his personal connections. We're not Britannians, after all, desperately trying to pad our fragile egos." I paused as I gave him an opportunity to respond, levelly meeting his hostile gaze. After the counselor proved himself wise enough to not take the obvious bait, I continued. "If you have a personal problem with Nagata, that's between the two of you. I'm not your mother and I won't force you to kiss and make up." "But," I growled, "when you make your personal rivalry my problem. When you waste what precious time I have with your nonsense and petty animosity. When you waste all of our time dragging us out to some warehouse in order to grandstand to a captive audience. Well, now you have entirely exceeded my personal capacity for patience. So, I am telling you now to stop making this my problem. Settle matters between yourselves or get over it. If there is actual theft, bring me evidence that I can use. Solve your problem, or I will solve it for you, and I assure you that you will neither like nor enjoy my solution." I paused, looking for any sign of give in Counselor Nishizumi's deeply tanned and lined face. Am I understood? Counselor Nishizumi's jaw clenched, and for a moment I thought he would actually take a swing at me. The old sailor loomed over me, glaring down and all but demanding that I submit. I refused to look away or step back, and for a long, silent minute, we teetered on the edge of escalation. Then, the big man subsided. The old merchantman slipped away and the politician swam forwards to take his place. "Oh, I understand you," he agreed readily, and for all that his voice was level and his volume approximately normal, his tone was only a small step above a growl. "I thank you very kindly for your wise advice, Commander." Nishizumi's expression was closer to a pained grimace than anything recognizable as a smile. "I can see why young Kozuki entrusted his city to your just rule. So, you want evidence, do you? Fine. That's fine. I'll make sure you get all the evidence you could possibly need to see your way clear to giving my people what's theirs and getting that thieving rat well away from me." "If such evidence exists," I confirmed, nodding slightly but not breaking eye contact for an instant, "I will review it objectively and follow up on it if I find any indications of rule-breaking, hoarding, or embezzlement." Good, good. The notable's reply came out in a horrible almost crooning sing-song, his smile frozen and immobile on his face as if it had disconnected from the mind behind it. "Of course, I never had any doubts that you'd do any less, Commander. I know exactly what my duties are." I didn't bother to keep the snap out of my voice. "I know exactly who and what I fight for. The people of Central Kamiaki are not forgotten. Nor are their interests. I will not stand for anybody in my organization to impede or misrepresent those interests, just as I will not permit any factional division while we live under the Britannian hammer." "Of course you wouldn't," Counselor Nishizumi cried out, mocking horror at the very idea. "After all, there's no way that young Kozuki's substitute would ever stoop to something so unjust as separate standards or crass nepotism. Certainly not. After all," he continued, a smirk curdling on his lips, "there's certainly no way a fine young lady like yourself would ever stoop to something so Britannian, now is there?" More posturing followed, but I stubbornly refused to rise to the bait or give the counselor the satisfaction of knowing any of his barbs had found purchase. I kept my eyes fixed on the tiresome old man's until his bluster finally subsided, when he gathered his small party and at long last made his exit, all the while making none too subtle threats about nebulous evidence he would present at the next gathering of the notables. I waited until Counselor Nishizumi had left the Rising Sun meeting house before I called for Nagata. Despite all of the morning's efforts, the issue of the Kamiaki meeting house and its relations with the local notable remained open. Between the inspection which had turned up nothing of note and the counselor's own words, it was abundantly clear that the question of unfair distributions was a mere pretense for a more personal quarrel, one I hadn't been aware of before I'd blundered into it. Such, I had found out to my great annoyance, were the ways of politics. No wonder Naoto had been so eager to shift it all onto my shoulders. And yet, like it or not, it was my mess to clean up as the only meaningful authority in Shinjuku. I would do my best. To do anything less would be to betray myself and all of the work of my comrades and co-workers. But to resolve this irritation, one among many, I needed to learn where its roots were, so I could rip it out entirely. As it turned out, they lay in infuriatingly shallow soil. He was Ami's boyfriend when I met her 4 years ago, Nagata said, answering my question immediately and without further prompting. They were together when I met her, and she left him for me. I see. I nodded, grasping for reasonability. And there wasn't any overlap, was there, Nagata? No possible reason why any third party might reasonably conclude that either Ami was cheating on Mr. Nishizumi or that you stole her from the man? Assure me that much, please. The relationship was all but over already, he protested, although I saw guilt flash across his face for an instant. She was already planning to move out before I even met her. She told me that they were through and she was leaving him, so I went ahead and took my chance. So that's why he accused you of theft, is it? I sighed. This entire mess, all that shouting, all over some stupid soap opera tier relationship drama? To be fair to Mr. Nagata, Masatsugu put in from where he stood by the only door out of Nagata's office, on the second floor of the Rising Sun meeting hall. Nishizumi's a piece of shit. He used to be a sub-boss for the Kokirikai, back in the old days. Once the purest fuckfaces broke them up, he spun his group off into their own gang, the Oni. They were bastards then and they're still bastards now. I don't blame Miss Ami for ditching his old ass. I didn't ask for your input, Masatsugu, I replied, turning on him. Seeing my bodyguard's scarred face, a thought occurred to me. Weren't you in a gang too, Masatsugu? Who was your boss? You killed him, he replied with a broad grin. Well, not you personally, but me and my crew were King's men. I quickly ran the name through my mind, trying to remember where I'd heard it before. One of the Kawadacho gangs, right? That was the group who used to control the refrain trade in Shinjuku, wasn't it? That's the one, he confirmed. But, well, you know how the big boys used to operate, right? The difference between core members and the rest of us, yeah? In my mind's eye, 2 groups of gangsters forced their way into a communal dinner, ready to steal our food and anything else that took their fancy. One group was as well fed as any Japanese in the ghetto, their hair bleached blonde and sporting shoddy imitations of Britannian fashion. The other group was a pack of wretched-looking men. Their clothes were almost as ragged as everybody else's, and only the scarves wound around their arms and the knives and bats in their hands announced their status as gang members. Indeed, I managed a half-smile at the man. Well, I appreciate your willingness to work for me now. I am sure that, with your help, the rising sun will continue to climb ever higher into the heavens. I appreciate you braving the heat and joining me here for the express purpose of wasting your morning. Yes, Commander. His salute was full of vigor yet sloppy, a gesture he had seen others do and tried his best to emulate. I had selected him for his current duty based on that keenness, and though he didn't know it yet, his place in one of the upcoming school cohorts was guaranteed. Keenness aside, the glowing respect and pride I saw in his eyes when he looked at me made me uncomfortable. I was respected by my companions and friends in the Kozuki organization, both the old Kozuki cell members and the men and women I trained with at the school. They knew I was a capable individual, and treated me as such. That said, they'd also seen me when I screwed up, when I was weak, when I was vulnerable, and so none of them looked at me with the hero worship I could see glowing in Masatsugu's eyes. Except for that one evening when Naoto saw my magic. I shuddered and pushed that memory away. It had been profoundly uncomfortable to see adulation on my leader's face as he gazed upon the fire in my hand. I turned away from that uncomfortable reverence, back to the familiar territory represented by Nagata's stoic face. Let me know if Nishizumi tries anything, Nagata. I'll send a unit or 2 of Sun Guard from other districts, just to help out on some projects in the area, for the next few days. That ought to send a message. As you say, Commander, Nagata nodded attentively, clearly relieved that I wasn't delving any further into any potential misdeeds he might have committed against Nishizumi. I was tempted to tell Nagata to knock it off with the title, that he'd known me when I was Tanya and that he'd more than earned the right to call me by name. And yet, I thought, I'm not just Hajime Tanya now. I'm Commander Hajime, head of the Shinjuku Rising Sun. Cringing away from that helps nobody, and if embracing the title and authority helps keep other parasites like Nishizumi in their place. I returned his nod. Best of luck with next week's distribution, Nagata. Back at the Rising Sun headquarters, the original meeting house and distribution center in the Waseda district of central Shinjuku, I had another meeting to attend. Thankfully, it was conducted inside and over lunch, a welcome break from the heat of noon. All right, I said, pushing the empty rice bowl away and bringing the chatter to an immediate halt. Let's get started. We're all quite busy these days and we've got a lot to get through, so please keep your reports short. If I want further detail, I'll schedule a follow-up so everybody else won't need to hang around. My 6 lunchtime companions nodded in a chorus of bobbing heads. This little assembly consisted of an equal number of skilled experts and picked members of the Sun Guard militia whom I felt had shown enough responsibility to shoulder a few of the tasks I could delegate. Much like the Sun Guard, I had fished the experts from the sea of humanity constrained within Shinjuku's enclosing walls. Taken together with the currently absent Ino and Nagata, they constituted my leadership commission. The first to speak was one of the experts, a scrawny man even by the malnourished standards of Shinjuku by the name of Junji. Before the conquest, he had worked at the Japan Broadcasting Corporation's FM radio station servicing the western parts of Tokyo Prefecture as a technician, in charge of maintaining and repairing radio equipment. In recent months, he had become the backbone of our expanding pirate radio network. The Gunma relay is up and functional again, as of yesterday, Junji said, starting the meeting off on a high note. Seems like it was just a wiring issue, easy enough to fix that I was able to walk your man there through the process via text. I should warn you, he continued, his tone dipping as he tried to convey the gravity of the matter, the parts issue still needs to be addressed. We can only stretch what we have so far. When the Rising Sun's activities had been all but entirely confined to Shinjuku, it had been easy to conceal our communications. We had used burner phones and cryptic word choice to reduce the chances that any Britannian intelligence officer monitoring cell traffic in and near the ghetto would be able to piece our operations together, but that strategy had relied mostly upon the protective camouflage of a city's worth of communication obscuring our handful of calls and texts. Now that the Rising Sun had begun to spread out into the rural areas of central Honshu, spearheaded by Nato and Suwakairo Azogi and Tamaki kept an eye on the school, relying on luck and Britannian laziness was no longer acceptable. Cell traffic, routed through Britannian telecom companies and their cell towers, was too risky. Which was when Junji had brought himself to my attention. The former radio technician had heard that I was looking for new routes of communication and had placed his professional experience at my disposal. Indeed, he had been practically giddy to tell me everything he could about operating a radio network, which unfortunately led to a lengthy lecture heavily laden with technical details that were, broadly speaking, entirely lost on me. But more importantly, Junji had come through with a connection to some shady honorary Britannians with unspecified access to a warehouse full of last-generation radio equipment, all second-hand from various commercial stations upgrading their equipment to the current models provided by some noble monopoly or another. Thankfully, Junji's connections had been all too eager to sell whatever outdated surplus equipment we needed at very reasonable rates. And, after the first shipment had arrived, Junji had set to work with gusto. He had been eager to return to indoor work without any heavy lifting after weeks of helping to pack new insulation into the freshly repaired crawl spaces of various tenements around Shinjuku, although he had been less happy when I told him that his technical expertise had landed him a post on the newly organized leadership commission. Within weeks, antennas began to appear throughout the Shinjuku ghetto, each connected to concealed receivers. So far, our crude little network was quite small and almost entirely confined to Shinjuku. 5 transmitters, each broadcasting on a different frequency, were scattered around Shinjuku, with the nearest located in a building down the street from the Rising Sun's headquarters. More recently, Ogi had managed to get his own receiver/transmitter established in an abandoned farm near the school. Unfortunately, his gear lacked the range to communicate directly with us, so a team had been dispatched to install a relay in a small shack on the slopes of Sakurayama, just over the Gunma-Saitama border. Your concerns are noted, I replied, nodding to Junji. Money's tight, but I'll reach out to my partner to see if he's got anything in our price range. Feel free to ask around yourself, by the way. Surely someone's worked as a janitor in one of the Britannian stations or whatever. If they know about anything easily stolen, bring it to me and I'll see if it's feasible. Junji nodded and sat down, his report apparently completed. I suppose if we can talk to Naoto and Ogi again, we can pick up the pace of the evacuations? I turned to the woman next to him, one of the Sun Guard militia officers I'd picked out for special attention. What are your thoughts on the matter, Lieutenant? The title sat uneasily on the shoulders of the recently dubbed Lieutenant Ichiya, who very much lacked any sort of military bearing. And yet, I had dropped the title on her anyway. The Kozuki organization and its appendages had reached the point where a formalized chain of command was necessary. Even though Naoto, Ogi, and I were handing the ranks out more or less as a matter of fiat, all three of us had agreed to insist they be respected. So far, nobody had pushed back against the rash of sudden promotions. This lieutenant in particular had the dubious honor to be the point woman for one of the Rising Sun's most ambitious projects to date, the steady evacuation of as many people out of Shinjuku Ghetto and the Tokyo settlement as possible. It'll definitely help, being able to talk to Gunmu again, Lieutenant Ichiya said, belatedly rising to her feet as she realized that everybody else in the room had turned to look at her. I mean, I guess that's pretty obvious, but it'll really make things easier, especially when some people get lost or whatever. Which, you know, happens, especially during the night handoffs. 5 weeks ago, I had sent out several volunteer units of Sun Guard to establish way stations on the route Naoto and I had agreed upon between Shinjuku and his current location in the mountains north of Takasaki. The way stations traced a line from Asaka just over the Tokyo Saitama prefectural border to the outskirts of Honjo, just south of Takasaki, and each had hiding spots for 2 or 3 trucks and up to 100 tightly packed people. Ever since the last way station was finally established, at Ogawa, in Saitama Prefecture, after the original station was discovered and destroyed by the local honorary Britannian auxiliaries, up to 100 people every night had slipped out of the ghetto, following paths through derelict subway tunnels and sewers under the ghetto walls and out into the surrounding settlement, where waiting trucks carried them to the first way station. Broadly speaking, Lieutenant Ichiya continued, things are going about as well as we could reasonably ask for. I mean, she grimaced, shit happens. Trucks break down, someone has a heart attack, whatever. But, the important part is, there's no sign that the Brits have realized anything's up. The only time we've run into anything like a patrol was just a pack of traitors, and they were happy enough to take the money once the driver told them a baron up north had bought the cargo. She's getting better, I thought, noting how the lieutenant's hands barely shook at the mention of traffickers. Hopefully, she continues along that trajectory. A less jumpy officer would be ideal. Lieutenant Ichiya had earned her promotion by stepping up from Chihiro's crowd to take her leader's place in her absence. Almost as soon as Chihiro had left the ghetto, I had begun working to reintegrate her free company back into the main Rising Sun organization, starting by giving Ichiya her rank and handing her responsibilities that extended past the several hundred freed slaves who had fallen into Chihiro's orbit. Now I nodded at my officer's report, impassive despite my anger. Not at the lie, but rather because the fact that the local honorary Britannian police had accepted it implied that it hadn't been the first time they'd stopped a truck loaded with Japanese. And the drivers probably weren't lying, most of those other times. Sometimes, it was very difficult to remember why I had continued to lobby against the general desire to kill any honorary we could reach. Intellectually, I knew that excising however many % of the Japanese population who had taken up oaths to the invaders was counterproductive, especially in a theoretical post-independence state, even more so when that percentage represented the bulk of the recently educated population. Emotionally, though. Remember, I told myself, if you could have taken up the oaths and become an honorary Britannian, if that path had truly represented a better life with upward mobility, you certainly would be on the other side of that line now. Very good, I said, nodding at the lieutenant. Keep up the good work. Let me know if you need further resources. Besides, I raised a quelling hand, seeing the words already forming in her mouth, besides the usual rations and such. Ino said she found a contact who'd recently come into possession of 2 shipping containers worth of Britannian Army ration packs, so hopefully that will be handled for the next few weeks, at least. Lieutenant Ichiya subsided with a curt nod, and I moved on to the next person waiting. Miss Tsuchiya, do you have anything to report? The teacher gave me a wan smile as she stood to address the room. I'd spoken with the woman a handful of times since we'd first met back in April, the latest of which had been when I had requested her presence on this commission. All of those conversations had unfortunately been quite stilted and awkward for both of us. Miss Tsuchiya clearly didn't know quite how to interact with me, someone the age of her students yet a major political figure, and speaking with her always reminded me of things and times I'd rather not think about. Her invitation to sit in on some of her classes with my age group peers still hung between us. She had reassured me once that the invitation would always be open, should I choose to accept it, but despite thanking her I had never felt the impulse to go. Frankly, I didn't know how attending a middle school level class could possibly benefit me, considering the memories I carried of my previous lives' educational experiences. And besides, I thought as I smiled encouragingly at the former educator, the head of both the embryonic Shinjuku educational system and the vocational training program, I have no desire to see the children of Shinjuku, or, rather, the other children of Shinjuku. Life in the ghetto with all of its daily tragedies is depressing enough without seeing all of those two old faces. I see that enough in the mirror. Or without seeing those children with their parents, with their mothers. Just brushing up against that word brought a familiar stinging pain and an upsurge of memories. Despite the time, they were still as sharp as always, as difficult to handle. It's like a broken tooth, I considered, or some exposed nerve that I just can't help probing every now and again. Every time I do so, it hurts, but I just can't quite leave it alone. Thankfully, despite my earlier admonition, Miss Tsuchiya seemed in no hurry to speak, so I didn't miss any of her words with my wool gathering. Perhaps she had been waiting for my focus to return to her, some teacher's instinct informing her that her intended audience wasn't quite ready yet to learn, but it was only when she saw my infinitesimal nod that she began. The recruitment program is outpacing my expectations, she began, glancing down at her notes to check her figures. It seems like my fellow educators are quite eager to return to their professions. As of this week, I have managed to secure the services of 64 primary school instructors, 35 secondary school educators, and 17 college-level lecturers with varying specialties. I've also managed to find 53 early learning and childcare specialists who are willing to help run a kindergarten program as well. On the vocational training front, Miss Tsuchiya flipped to a different page in her notebook and took a second to refresh herself on the figures before looking back up to meet the collective gaze of the room. It's been a bit harder going since many of the prospective instructors are otherwise engaged with the construction projects and the like. Still, I managed to find a number of electricians, plumbers, and carpenters willing to teach. I've also found a few former nurses who are willing to conduct first aid classes as well. Junji, I said, turning back to the radio technician, who had been taking the opportunity to make headway into a second helping of beans and rice. He startled to his feet at the sound of his name, gulping down his mouthful. Why yeah? He got out, licking a few errant grains from his lips to the general amusement of the gathering. What's up, Commander? Get in contact with Miss Tsuchiya and get some classes scheduled, I instructed, ignoring the unprofessional sniggering echoing from certain corners of the room at the radio technician's expense. Your skills are too valuable to live solely inside your head. Besides, this way you'll have other people to foist handling tech support questions off on, not to mention extra hands to help carry the load as the network expands. When I'd begun, Junji'd had a distinctly uncooperative expression plastered across his face. At the implication that he'd no longer have to walk unskilled Shinjuku residents turned rural guerrillas through the basics of radio setup and maintenance, he brightened visibly. Then he paled, as some new and terrible thought dawned on him. Wait, but... I gestured impatiently for him to continue. Does that mean I'd have to teach those classes? Yes, I said, not entirely without sympathy. I know, public speaking can be a hassle. But, we all have our sacrifices to make for the cause. He nodded resignedly at that and retook his seat, turning his attention back to his food as I turned my attention back to my very own Minister for Education, if on a tiny scale. Thank you for your report, Miss Tsuchiya. Please keep up the recruitment efforts. Have you had any success finding usable textbooks in Japanese? Not much, she admitted, before adding, but I'm still looking, Commander Hajime. I'm sure I'll turn something up eventually. They can't have burned everything. Her mouth tightened. I hope. In my mind, Naruko Tenjin Shrine burned again, the last place of worship in Shinjuku gone up in flames as the last doddering priest of the kami bled out in a gutter 2 streets away. They certainly could have, I thought, seeing a similar awareness writ across Miss Tsuchiya's face. After all, mere numbers have no need of culture and less need of books and educational materials. And besides, even if the Britannians hadn't burnt every remnant of Japan in their reach, who would prioritize keeping books safe and dry over 6 years' worth of flooding, fire, and rot? Especially when even wood for cooking fuel was so scarce. I'm sure you'll find something eventually, I said, deciding to outwardly buy into the optimistic dream of some hidden cache of Japanese literature waiting to be rediscovered in the ghetto, and I'll pass a message to Nato, asking him to keep his eyes peeled for any books he might find out in the rural villages. In the meantime, why don't you set those professors you dug up to the work of putting something together for use until more books are found? The look on Miss Tsuchiya's face was almost pathetically grateful, and I didn't know if it came from the understanding and support I'd extended, or if it was because I hadn't brought the cruel hammer of reality down on her head. Either way, she humbly ducked her head and thanked me before sitting back down. As with seemingly every interaction I had with the woman, I felt Richard immediately afterwards. Oki should have been here, he was a teacher as well and could speak to Miss Tsuchiya as a peer, without all these complications. It wasn't that Miss Tsuchiya was unpleasant, or that I found speaking with her a burden, as much as it was that I had difficulty handling what she represented. With her teachers rested the last hope of saving some part of our fading and torn culture, to preserve what it was to be Japanese in the minds of the young. The hope that the people of Shinjuku would have a future beyond a life of hard work and drudgery, a future that extended past walls pocked with bullet holes, a future where people would have the time and freedom to sit and read, to learn, to develop new ideas that weren't chiefly concerned with guaranteeing that tomorrow would come. Sometimes, it was very difficult indeed, to keep that hope alive. The hollows under Miss Tsuchiya's eyes were a wordless testament to her own private troubles and worries. In her obvious gratitude for even the crumbs of support I could offer, I could plainly see how tenuous her own hopes for the future were. Pointedly turning my face away from Miss Tsuchiya, I moved on to the first figure seated on the other side of the table. Asahara Hayashi was just as I remembered him from our first meeting, in the waning days of last November. The engineer looked like a man from a different world, or perhaps a different time. In his 50s, he was at least 10 years older than anybody else in attendance, and his smug, almost haughty expression betrayed no concession to 6 years of hard living in Shinjuku, nor the loss of the lower half of his left leg. For all that his crutches rested against the wall behind him, his neat button-up shirt and slightly stained tie made it look like he had just stepped out of some pre-conquest office to join our meeting. "Mr. Hayashi," I began, my tone coolly respectful, "how are your projects progressing? Anything to report?" "Nothing worth my time," he grumped. "Nothing particularly difficult to manage, except in terms of scale and the need to explain every last thing to the work crews." "But you are still making progress despite that impediment, I hope?" I knew the answer already. The stench of new asphalt hung over the length and breadth of Shinjuku like morning fog. Every entrance to old subway tunnels was a hive of activity, and buildings with particularly spacious basements were hubs for foot traffic in and out. Yes, Mr. Asahara replied, his wave impatient. "Things are well in hand. Just over half of the old subway tunnels are navigable now, and those should be sealed against the worst of the wet for when the rain comes back. As for the air raid bunkers, we crossed 400 of them yesterday. Keep in mind, though, that they won't do a thing against a direct hit." "Noted," I replied in the same desultory tone as he'd spoken in. "We just need places where non-combatants can hide, not a bunker fit for the Prime Minister, if we still had one." "How are the nest installations going?" The nests fell into two broad categories, but both referred to specifically strengthened and fortified rooms in the many cadaverous, unevenly canting buildings across the Shinjuku skyline. The nests at or just above street level had been reinforced with concrete slabs and piles of sandbags. If the Britannians pushed into Shinjuku in earnest, each would be manned by Sun Guard or Kozuki organization rifle units. If I could get crew-served weapons out of the 6 houses, some of those low-altitude strongpoints would become machine gun nests. The high-altitude nests were comparatively skimpy, just rooms that had been lined with thermal blankets to baffle the infrared scanners built into Nightmare Facts spheres, with heaps of sandbags at the windows to provide some additional cover for those inside. These locations would, if necessary, become the haunt of smaller kill teams equipped with long-range scoped rifles and any shoulder-launched anti-armor or anti-air weapons I could shake loose from Kyoto's pockets. "They're fine," Mr. Asahara replied shortly. "They're completely useless at the moment, since you don't have anything to put in them and your militia are too amateurish to be effective, but at least hauling sandbags up 20 flights of stairs gives the men who aren't doing anything productive something to do." That comment earned a round of angry muttering from the 3 militia officers present, but a quick glare at the trio brought them back to grudging silence. "Thank you for your insight, Mr. Asahara," I said, not letting an iota of sarcasm reach my voice. "Now, about the special project?" "All handled, don't worry about it." For the first time at this meeting, a smile flickered across Mr. Asahara's face. "Anybody stupid enough to pilot a Sutherland is gonna get what's coming to them, assuming your boys aren't asleep on the switch." For a moment, the old engineer looked almost wistful. "It's been fun, doing something that actually has a bit of scale for a change. After fiddling with pressure cookers and pipe bombs for years, it's a nice return to form." And what, I wondered, was that form you so clearly long for, if building wire-detonated anti-vehicle mines and carefully setting them in recesses in the roadbed below the fresh pavement represents a return to it? I didn't vocalize that question, partially because I knew I wouldn't get a straight answer, and partially because I could tell he was desperate for someone to ask so he could pointedly not answer. "Damn drama queen." "I rejoice for you," I replied, my dry response in lieu of asking the baited question. "Anything else to report?" "Not in regards to the work," Mr. Asahara replied, elegantly moving on from the unasked question and almost managing to fully conceal the quick flash of disappointment. "But, I do have something else I need to speak to you about. Preferably, alone. And there's my post-meeting appointment, I suppose." I nodded my assent to his request, and the one-legged engineer relaxed back into his chair. "Nothing further, Commander." Ignoring his smirk at my title, I nodded at the militia officer sitting next to Asahara, a lanky specimen with closely cropped hair and a face disfigured by a long, ropey scar that slashed a line from the center of his forehead down along the bridge of his nose and across his lips, terminating at the chin. Even ignoring the badly healed cut that divided his features into two, his face was particularly spare, as if someone had boiled all the fat away from under the skin. Perhaps that had been a further result of his disfiguring injury, some fever melting away at him from the inside. Without further prompting, Lieutenant Koichi stood. Unlike Lieutenant Ichiya, the man didn't seem to find his new rank discomforting in the slightest, standing easily in a position approximating parade rest. "Commander," he acknowledged, lowering his head slightly in a suggestion of a bow. "Nothing extraordinary to report. Of course, should you wish further detail." His voice trailed off suggestively, hinting at a wealth of data at my disposal. Very comfortable with his new standing indeed, I mused, meeting Koichi's eyes. For all that his injury left his face nearly immobile, his eyes were lively, expressive and thoughtful. Perhaps a bit too comfortable, now that I think about it. Lieutenant Koichi's special unit of Sun Guard drew from the militia units of several different districts, but most came from the areas of Shinjuku with the longest history with the rising sun. In fact, some of his men and women came from the same tenement I'd lived in with Naoto and Ilgi. Many of them had previously assisted Naoto with his special work, the details of which had only been made clear to me after Naoto had left for the country. While the newly formed special unit had the same hakamaki tied around their foreheads as all other Sun Guard units, they also wore navy blue sashes over whatever else they happened to be wearing, setting themselves apart from their comrades. Initially, I had planned to institute an armband, but changed my mind when I remembered that the common way to display gang loyalty had been scarves of the gang's colors tied around the bicep. Considering the work the special unit, the Internal Affairs Force, would be handling, anything that spoke of gangsterism had to be avoided to the greatest extent possible. Especially since the IF, with the most loyal of the various Sun Guard units in its ranks, is the closest thing Shinjuku has to a police force now. I tried not to frown at the thought. And yet, thief-taking is only their secondary duty. Their main job is to make sure that all of the mutterings don't turn into action. For that, if for no other reason, Lieutenant Koichi is well placed to act as their chief. Let's schedule a meeting for tomorrow, I replied, mentally penciling the appointment into my schedule. We can go over your details in greater length then, without detaining everybody else present. The intact corner of Koichi's mouth flicked up at that, amused by my choice of words. As you like it, Commander, the policeman nodded, settling back down into his chair. Just let me know where and when. I will, I assured him, before moving my gaze to the last member of the commission in attendance. Lieutenant Fumiaki, what news do you have from the missions to Ibaraki and Kanagawa? A mixed bag, Commander. Lieutenant Fumiaki was another of the seemingly endless crowd of hard-working men who populated the ghetto, all calloused hands and careworn faces. Unlike most of those hard workers, however, and unlike everybody else in the room with the exception of myself, Lieutenant Fumiaki, also known as June, was a hafu. Born to a Korean father and a Japanese mother, the lieutenant had the good fortune to look almost entirely Japanese, something that I could have resented him for if it wasn't for his easy charm and eternally buoyant personality. We've been hearing daily reports back from Yoshi and the boys you sent to Ibaraki, he continued, correcting himself by hastily adding Captain Yoshi, sorry. But, he continued, communication with Yokohama's been decidedly more spotty. I don't think we've heard from Lieutenant Chihiro in at least 4 days or so. And even before that, we hardly heard at all from her and her lot. Well, that has the potential to be quite worrying. It was difficult to decide what was more likely, that Chihiro had encountered some enemy action or adverse accident that had destroyed her capability to communicate with us via any one of the number of burner phones she'd left Shinjuku with, or if she had simply pitched another temper tantrum. Either way, it was bad news. While I cared little for Chihiro or her welfare, I had sent 2 of her more vocal allies along with her, and as their leader, I had a duty towards them. That said, there's only so much I can do from Shinjuku. I have neither the time nor the freedom to take a day trip down to Yokohama. I do have the freedom to send someone in my stead, however. Someone, find a trustworthy messenger, I said, scribbling a quick note to Ino on my notepad to entrust one of our portable receivers to the bearer of the note, someone who knows how to drive. Tell them to pick up a radio and whatever they need and get out of Shinjuku. Once they're out, they're to steal a car and head south, but be careful. The Britannians mustn't know. Ask Ino for where she thinks Chihiro's set up. If they can't find the lieutenant in a day or 3, they're to turn around and head back home. Lieutenant Ichiya all but snatched the note from my hand and hustled her way out of the room. Considering her personal connection to Chihiro, I was unsurprised that she volunteered for the duty. Hopefully she doesn't add a secondary message of her own. The thought was reflexive paranoia. Even if Ichiya was keeping Chihiro privately updated, it didn't particularly matter. Not yet, at least. Either way, the matter was settled for now. Putting the issue out of my mind, I turned back to Lieutenant Fumiaki with a polite smile. So, what does Captain Yoshi have to say for himself? Is he enjoying the fresh salt air? This time of year? Lieutenant Fumiaki asked with a smile. I know I sure would, Commander. Beats the Tokyo heat, hands down. But, he said, sobering back up, it sounds like he's made some further progress since his last update. While he's not exactly been heavy on the details for obvious reasons, he wanted you to know that the fish are in the sea, if that means anything. Indeed it does, I thought, allowing a smile. It means that Yoshi's made excellent progress indeed. I had sent Yoshi and his squad of trained Kozuki organization soldiers to Ibaraki accompanied by 2 squads of Rising Sun men for 2 reasons, 3 if I included Naoto's claim that seeking the blessings of the gods enshrined on the coast would bring us good fortune. The first reason was to set up a subsidiary Rising Sun branch in the prefecture north of Chiba and to recruit more soldiers for our cause among the fishing villages and harbor towns there. The second reason was to seek out and contact the smugglers operating out of those same coastal settlements. The phrase fish are in the sea meant that he'd finally come to an agreement with at least one smuggling crew that he felt was reliable enough to be good business partners. Based on his previous reports, the crew in question was probably connected with one of the numerous triads who worked hand in glove with the Chinese government. The Chinese represented a sea of opportunities matched only by the net of practically inevitable entanglements those opportunities came with. And like the sea, Chinese politics represented an almost entirely unseen depth of unknown dangers and cold secrets. To say I was hesitant about forming even tentative connections with the Chinese would be an understatement, for all that the remnants of the Republic of Japan's government had fled to the Chinese Federation and formed a government in exile. I was under no illusion that the Chinese would be any more kind to us than the Britannians. On the other hand, if I'm already willing to go to bed with collaborators, why not foreign powers as well? That's good news indeed, Lieutenant, I said aloud, nodding at Lieutenant Fumiaki and fully aware of how Lieutenant Koichi was staring fixedly at my face, clearly trying to suss out whatever clues he could about the Ibaraki operation. It was outside his brief and so he had no real need to know, but that he was curious nonetheless was obvious. If there isn't anything else? No, Commander. With that, Lieutenant Fumiaki dropped back down into his seat, pulling the remains of his lunch back towards him. A practical man, he clearly had no intention of letting anything in his bowl go to waste. Well, on that high note, I rose from my chair, painfully aware that I was the shortest person in the room as I stood at the head of the table and yet remained shorter than everybody else there except for Miss Tsuchiya. Thank you all for attending this meeting. I appreciate all of the hard work you put into your responsibilities, and I expect nothing less than that level of dedication moving forwards. You are all free to go, although I believe you had something we needed to discuss, Mr. Asahara? Recognizing their cue to leave, the other 4 men and women said their goodbyes and made their way out of the private room on the second floor of the Rising Sun headquarters. After Lieutenant Koichi, predictably the last to leave, closed the door behind himself, I turned back to the engineer again, waiting to hear whatever it was he had that required privacy. You'll be having a visitor soon, said Mr. Asahara, his tone brisk and matter-of-fact, stripped of his usual condescension. In fact, he continued as he checked his watch, you can probably expect her to show up at the Yotsuya gate in 30 minutes. Right, I said, scanning his face for any subtext that I had overlooked, any non-verbal hints. There was nothing but the usual scowl. So, let's skip ahead a bit in this conversation and assume that we've done the usual polite conversational dance. I assume that the need for privacy is because you are announcing this guest not as a local engineering expert, but rather because you are the agent of Kyoto House placed closest to me. I wouldn't know about that, he demurred, but you are correct in the basics, Commander Hajime. Your business partners back in the old capital requested that I bring this to your personal attention, in large part because you will be held directly responsible for any misfortune your guest might come to. Damn that pack of old geezers. Why would they send someone they didn't consider expendable to a place like Shinjuku? They might as well have sent their precious and uninvited guest into the heart of Niigata. In fact, I snarled to myself, keeping my face as stoically blank as I could manage, sending some hapless old fool into Niigata might have been safer, now that the purists have broken the spine of the popular uprising. Wait. An uninvited guest. That could be my way out. I don't accept that responsibility, I said, speaking just as bluntly as Asahara had when he'd leveled Kyoto's latest threat. I did not invite the 6 houses to send an emissary, nor did they send adequate warning for me to even consider guaranteeing security. Besides, we in Shinjuku have precious little, as you well know, Mr. Asahara, far too little to provide hospitality to any visiting guest from Kyoto. Don't bother trying to convince me, came the unfortunately unsurprising response. I'm just the messenger, I have absolutely no say in the houses or their doings. I'm not asking you if you're willing to accept a guest. I'm telling you that a guest is going to show up on your doorstep any minute now, and if anything happens to her, it'll be on your head. At least he has the grace to not make any pretense of an apology, I thought with an internal grimace. Still, I suppose this isn't much different than the worthless president of some company demanding a job for his worthless nephew. In fact, if any of Kyoto's ilk existed back in the Japan of my first life, I would bet anything that they made exactly that sort of demand on a regular basis. Fine, I sighed, giving in to the inevitable with bad grace. So, I've got a guest. Who is he, what does he look like, and how long is he going to be around? Should I set aside a toothbrush for him as well? Or was he able to find a place in his bags for his own? Suddenly, the image of a fat old man dressed in Britannian finery striding through Shinjuku popped into my mind, followed shortly by the likely reaction of the locals to the appearance of such a fool in their midst. Wait, I said, speaking up just in time to cut off Mr. Asahara's reply, please, Hayashi, Tell me that this idiot guest of mine brought their own security. Tell me that they didn't just walk through the settlement alone and unarmed, and are even now flashing a large amount of cash in front of the very Bible guards posted at the gate's checkpoint. I could tell you exactly that, said Mr. Asahara, visibly amused, to my great annoyance, which clearly only amused him still more. And indeed I will. Your guest has their own security, Commander, and the security will handle the gate negotiations. As for the rest, though? Asahara's lips quirked up into a smile under his salt and pepper mustache. Send one of your fine lieutenants with an honor guard to the gate, Commander. You don't need any other answer from me. I don't know what your guest wants or how long they will be here, but I do know that there's absolutely no way your militia will mistake her for anybody else. An angry retort died stillborn on my tongue as I picked up on the subtle emphasis the engineer had placed on that last pronoun. Her? Tea had been procured from somewhere, and likewise a variety of cookies and sweets. The second-hand tea service now sat in pride of place in the center of the same table I'd conducted my recent meeting around, clean enough to shine despite the numerous chips missing from the pot and mismatched saucers alike. And now that those minor details had been handled, I had nothing else to distract myself from the nervous energy coursing through me. Impatiently, I rose to my feet and paced another lap around the room for the fourth time in the last 10 minutes, checking my watch as I circled back around behind my chair. Assuming nobody was running late, Lieutenant Koichi and his detachment of picked men from the Internal Affairs Force should be meeting the emissary from Kyoto on our side of the Yotsuya Gate at any minute. My handheld radio remained stubbornly silent, though, as it had for the last 10 minutes since Koichi had relayed the news that he'd taken up a waiting position a block away from the checkpoint. Why am I wasting my time like this? More to the point, why am I letting myself get so worked up over this? It was a reasonable question. In my first life, I'd gone into meetings with senior vice presidents and directors free from worry, confident in myself and my place. In my second life, the periodic encounters with the likes of General Zeta had been undeniably stressful, but that stress had stemmed from the awareness that they could order me to the front or to a prison cell at any moment. While this new stranger from Kyoto undeniably had power over me, it couldn't match the same level of authority wielded by the Empire's generals. And yet, while I am undeniably stressed, I am not afraid. I paused, another lap around the meeting room behind me, and pursued the thought deeper. No, I don't fear this emissary from the fence riders in Kyoto. She can make any threat she likes, and in doing so will just undermine her position and that of her organization as reliable business partners. No, it isn't fear. It was, I realized after a further moment of contemplation, anxiety. While that sensation was a close cousin to fear, it wasn't quite the same. I didn't fear angering my unasked-for guest. The prospect of miscarrying my first interaction with a member of the secret cabal's ranks, of appearing like some foolish, out-of-her-depth child in front of this potentate. At the mere thought, I wiped my suddenly sweaty palms dry on my pants. You are worrying about nothing, I scolded myself. You are just engaged in pointless, self-sabotaging behavior. You have negotiated with the 6 houses before and achieved your goals. But that was back before Naoto left. And that was the heart of the matter. Somewhere along the way, I had made an undeniable mistake, and that mistake had continued to tumble down on my head as I made blunder after blunder. The interaction with Councillor Nishizumi this morning would have been unthinkable, were Naoto here, not unthinkable that a politician would use his power to pursue petty grievances, but unthinkable because the noble son would have soothed the man weeks ago with a disarming comment and some personal mediation between the notable and Nagata. In contrast, my own efforts had been crude, and while I had successfully punted the confrontation off for another week or so, I was under no illusion that I'd heard the last from Councillor Nishizumi. Making matters worse, that confrontation hadn't happened in a void. I had staggered forwards for the last 6 weeks, doing my best to hold things together and fully aware that the current state of affairs could only last for so long. This wasn't supposed to be my job. The wail sounded pathetic, even inside my own head. Naoto was supposed to be the political leader while Ogi handled the minutiae of internal affairs and administration. Unfortunately, the triumvirate I had worked out with Naoto and Ogi had of late, for a number of reasons, begun to come apart at the seams. While my conversations with Ogi had been short and stilted of late, that had been a function of the radio we were speaking through. Despite the heavy buzz of the static and the constant overs, The former teacher was always a joy to speak with, cordial and supportive and willing to listen as I complained about the council or the other 100 headaches that came from running Shinjuku. We had fallen into a bit of a routine of trying to find some item of good news we could exchange with the other during each of our conversations. He had been overjoyed to hear that I had reached out to Miss Sachiya and never failed to ask how the plans to re-establish the educational system in Shinjuku were progressing. In return, he had passed on the news of how he had prevailed upon Major Onoda to requisition a mortar and sufficient ammunition for training purposes at the school. Despite this, there was only so much Ogi could really do to help me. He could advise me on particular matters, what benefits modifying some internal policy might secure or how to best satisfy some stubborn faction's demand, but he couldn't teach me his skills as a mediator and trusted voice. Not for lack of trying, but the radio and our busy schedules made such lessons impractical. Besides, he'd been away from Shinjuku for long enough that his grasp on the local politics and personalities had slipped. With Naoto, the conversations had been equally stilted yet entirely free of the easy comfort I felt with Ogi. Naoto was cool and businesslike, his tone clearly audible even over the radio interference. Ogi called me Tanya, Naoto referred to me as Commander Hajime. He didn't protest when I referred to him by name, but he never reciprocated. The reason for the new reserve between us was the furthest thing from a mystery, even though we never addressed it directly. We never spoke about Callan. She hung heavily in the conversational air between us, her presence glaring in its absence. Kozuki Naoto, 12 years older than his baby sister, had always been Callan's steadfast protector and had always done whatever he could to keep her from harm. I'd overridden him once before on that matter when I had sent Callan into Shinjuku Gyome Station. He had barely accepted that brief and one-sided engagement. It had only been in the face of my reason and Callan's fervent passion that he had caved at all. And even then it had been the one time Naoto had ever threatened me. And now, I had thrown Callan into a prolonged deep cover project, seemingly on an impulse, without even consulting him. While I had explained my logic after the fact, once he and his mother Hitomi were well on their way to Gunma, the leader of the Kozuki organization had acknowledged the logic of my choice over his phone, not bothering to conceal the icy anger he clearly felt. Hitomi had refused to speak with me. Thankfully, Naoto was enough of a professional to remain in contact, updating me about the progress he had made in establishing hidden enclaves and refuges for the fleeing people of Shinjuku throughout Gunma, Tochigi, and Fukushima. He passed on word of the setbacks he experienced, of the villages discovered by patrolling honorary Britannians, of the vanloads of refugees ambushed by bandits, of the difficulties of making farmers from ghettoized city dwellers. He accepted my condolences with cool politeness and my advice with demure disinterest. I had passed on word of my troubles in Shinjuku to him as well, albeit just the bare facts of the matter, stripped of emotion. Naoto had been receptive to my worries, but it had felt like I was speaking to a mere co-worker. His suggestions had been vague and half-hearted, his expressions of solidarity mere platitudes. I worried that I had permanently damaged our relationship. But it was still the right call to make, I told myself. A chance to infiltrate an agent into a cadre of nightmare pilots in training would have been difficult to pass up, but a chance to infiltrate an agent into a cadre of nightmare pilots in training who were also being groomed for leadership was impossible to ignore. Once she returns to us, Callan will be a precious resource of institutional knowledge and skills, stolen from the classrooms of the strongest military in the world. And, a colder part of my mind, a segment shaped by cutthroat office politics and sharpened by the dispassionate calculus of the War College, remarked, if all it cost to acquire that edge was a single personal relationship, then I secured a true bargain, cheap at that cost. Even if the cost is Callan's life or the lives of 100 Callans, it would still be cheap. Even though the part of me that had stood watch on the Rhine and had calmly watched our René burn knew that statement to be true, another part of my mind recoiled against it. It was the part of my mind that had reeled in numb horror when Monabu and Sumire had died, the same part that had mourned the slaves killed in the crossfire back at the club in Shinjuku. The same part of me that had admitted that the members of the Kozuki cell were my friends in truth, not just useful tools. Everything had been so simple, back then, I thought, ludicrously nostalgic for the time when I had been near starvation, where seemingly any problem could be resolved with my knife and adequate creativity. Hard, yes, but simple. Fight against the gangs, make new connections, scrounge for food and money and weapons. Besides, I reminded myself, You knew getting Britannian-trained Japanese soldiers for the cause would be a fraught business. Sacrifices would have to be made for such momentous gains, that much was never in doubt. Admittedly, I conceded to myself, I had expected to recruit from the members of the honorary Britannian legions, who would recognize their true loyalties and bring their training with them when they crossed the line. I hadn't anticipated ordering anybody into Britannian service. A knock at the door returned me to the present. "Commander," came Lieutenant Koichi's voice, "are you ready? Your guest is here." "Yes," I replied, internally marveling at how steady my voice was, the anxiety of minutes before dropping away as if it had never been there at all. "Come in, please, Lieutenant. Don't keep our guest waiting." One of the lieutenant's detachment was the first man through the door, his spotless sash incongruous over his battered and much-mended grey t-shirt, a Britannian rifle slung over his shoulder. As he stepped into the meeting room, he turned on his heel with an almost military flair and took up a position by the wall, as smoothly as if he'd practiced that move for a week. Which, considering how worryingly passionate Lieutenant Koichi is about his newly awarded rank and duties, he might very well have. The next man through the door was what the Britannian aping gangsters of the 11 Lords and the Kokorokai had wanted to be. He wore a tailored suit with a matched tie and pocket square, both in a tasteful mahogany, and only his Japanese features and association with Kyoto House betrayed his honorary Britannian status. A bulge under his jacket, flattered into near invisibility by clever adjustments to the suit, hinted at a concealed pistol. Following the Internal Affairs Force man, he took up a position by the wall on the opposite side of the door. An impressive choice of guard, I thought appreciatively, noting the economy of motion and the way the man's eyes roamed over the room, searching for hidden threats and ways of ingress with a professional's detachment. I had briefly wondered if Kyoto was really treating this meeting with the gravity Mr. Asahara had implied, but the obvious quality of the guard put such thoughts to rest. Anybody they sent this man to watch over is clearly someone of value, someone who can make decisions or can speak directly with those who do. And then a girl only a few years older than me all but skipped through the door, utterly incongruous compared with the two men who had preceded her. I closed my eyes, but when I opened them, she was still there, neat as a pin in her tweed two-piece suit and smiling at me. For a moment, I wondered if I'd suffered some sort of mental break. "Ah," I thought, my face cracking into a wry smile to answer the girl's own radiant expression, "so this is how it feels to be on the other end of the introductions." I've always wondered if it was really that shocking to see a young girl in a leadership role, and, now that I've seen it from the other side of the table, I suppose I have my answer. Then, I remembered how it had felt to always be greeted with incredulity, astonishment, and all too often, a surprising degree of hostility. In my second life, it had been a continued source of private irritation to me, that no matter what I accomplished and no matter what respect my deeds might garner, so few of my fellow imperial officers would take me seriously in face-to-face meetings. Looking closer at the girl, apparently Kyoto's emissary since all I could see behind her were a second suited security man and Lieutenant Koichi, I could see signs of a similar concealed frustration. For all that the energy behind her smile seemed sincere, the expression itself was an unnatural thing, fixed and carefully practiced. It's her chosen armor, I realized, just like how my past insistence on imperial professionalism was mine. Only, for all that my age and gender made me a vulnerable target, my undeniable power as a mage and war college credentials gave me tools to push back instead of just holding the line via personal presentation. That damnable Silver Wings assault badge helped too. "Welcome to Shinjuku," I said, bowing over the table between me and the visitor in greeting. "On behalf of the rising sun, I sincerely hope that you had a safe and easy journey here." "It is good to be here," came the reply, and for a moment, I was back in my first life, visiting the old capital in all of its ancient majesty. The Kyoto dialect, slower than standard Japanese, harkened back to a different time and a different Japan, just like the city itself did. I hadn't heard anyone use it in my time in Shinjuku, except perhaps for the call with the Kyoto bigwig. It was a relic of a past world, a Japan from before the Republic, never mind the conquest. "Yes," she continued, and I realized that she had approached the table without my notice, resting her hands over the back of the nearest chair. "It is indeed good to be here. I have been eagerly awaiting the chance to meet you, Commander Hajime. Although, would you take offense if I called you Miss Tanya? At least," she giggled, "when it is only us girls talking." The moment dragged on for just a bit too long, and I suddenly realized that it was my turn to speak. Focus, damn it. You're fucking it up again. Excuse me, but, I coughed, gesturing at the three men lining the walls, and Lieutenant Koichi where he stood in front of the door to the room. Just us girls is a bit of a stretch, wouldn't you say? But, I'm not one to stand on ceremony. If you want to call me by name, I don't have any problem with that. I trailed off, leaving the meaningful silence hanging, waiting for her to offer me a name. It would be a false name, almost certainly, as the 6 houses were secretive by necessity and by nature, and I doubted any of their higher-ranking members would give out such information freely, no matter how young they were. Still, I needed something to call this envoy, and I didn't want to accidentally cause offense by simply assigning her a name. Lady Sophie, the girl promptly replied in Britannian. Despite the fact that her pronunciation of the language was perfect, almost as if she were a native speaker of the tongue of our overlords, it still sounded like an abomination after the smooth tones of her Kyoto Ben. But, she continued in our language, you can call me Kaguya, though. Or Lady Kaguya if you really must. The last name is not important. Charmed, I said, gesturing for her to take a seat as my mind whirled. Lady Kaguya, would you please join me for some light refreshments? I'm certain it won't live up to your standards, but some tea's always nice after a journey, no matter how safe and easy it was, yes? Ooh, please. Kaguya clapped her hands, her expression abruptly joyful as she slid into her seat. Here's a real 6 houses secret, Miss Danya, Kaguya, smiling slyly, said as her guards tensed. I have a really huge sweet tooth. What you got, huh? I blinked, trying to keep up with the sudden hairpin turns in Kaguya's presentation. First the shift from Kyoto dialect straight to Britannian, and now her high diction was abruptly abandoned in favor of a speech pattern that wouldn't have sounded unnatural among the attendees of Miss Tsuchiya's classes, all refinement vanishing. As I pushed the tray of sweets over towards Kaguya, I noticed her guards relaxing now that her so-called secret had been revealed. The fact that they tensed up at all over any such revelation is an interesting hint, I considered as Kaguya devoured a third of a cookie in a single ambitious bite. Clearly, even though Kaguya is important, she isn't the only person these men report to. Equally clearly, someone else gave them orders to intercede if Kaguya crossed certain lines. Interesting indeed. So, I began, trying to take some level of control over the conversation back. I have no wish to seem ungrateful for your company, Lady Kaguya, but I am very surprised by your presence here. Not that you are unwelcome here in any way, I quickly added, but I am accustomed to dealing with your organization through intermediaries and interlocutors. These are some good sweets, Tanya, Kaguya replied, thankfully after swallowing her current bite. I'll have to remember to send you some yatsuhashi once I get back home in thanks. I would certainly appreciate it, I said, speaking slowly as I pored over her words, searching for a hidden meaning that I suspected wasn't there at all. I haven't had yatsuhashi in quite a long time. Not since my first life, in fact, when someone gave me a box as a souvenir gift. Don't tell Lord Taizo or Lady Annabeth, Kaguya stage whispered, leaning in over the table like some conspirator in a play, but I don't really like them very much. I know they're traditional and all, but they're just not sweet enough to really scratch the itch, you know? Now, these, she hefted a store-bought chocolate chip cookie, taken from the supplies Ino bought to distribute among the take-home boxes for families with children, are really good. Do you have more? Yes, I replied, trying to match the 2 names to anybody I remembered from the news, or from Diethard's reports. Neither rang any bells. I'm sure we can find some more for you to take home with you if you so choose. Yay! Kaguya cheered, reaching for another cookie. Seriously, Miss Danya, you've got no idea. It's always look out for your weight, Kaguya, or it's not ladylike to eat cookies, Kaguya or something. You're a real lifesaver. I am, of course, happy to be of service to the 6 houses, I replied politely, trying to figure out what the point of this baffling visit was. Certainly, it wasn't just to eat cookies. Surely someone of the young lady's status and wealth could go to a Britannian store and buy her own if she was so hungry for the damned things, instead of scarfing down the limited quantity we had expended scarce resources to purchase. Perhaps if you explain more about what brings you to Shinjuku today, I could be of even greater service? And suddenly, Kaguya's eyes had turned unaccountably shifty. Well, There were several items of business I needed to handle in the Tokyo settlement, you see, and since I'd be in the area, you decided to drop by for a social visit? I asked, finishing my visitor's explanation for her as it trailed off into silence. Absolutely. And suddenly Kagaya was all smiles again, nodding in energetic affirmation for a moment before catching herself. I mean, she said, starting again, recently, there has been much discussion about the Rising Sun Benevolent Association and its sister organization. As I was in the Tokyo settlement already, I felt I could improve my understanding of the situation with a private fact-finding trip of my own. And then, the smile was back. Surely you don't mind, Miss Tanya? Not at all, I replied, the smile tight against my face. I am, of course, eager to assist the 6 houses in any way possible. After all, we both strive towards a common cause, don't we? What a disappointment. It's highly unlikely that this Kagaya has any real responsibilities or input on Kyoto House's policy if she's got sufficient freedom and time to swan off to Shinjuku on a whim. Even a treacherous conspiracy apparently has deadweight members. Still, even though impressing or pleasing her will likely gain me nothing, angering her could still shift the 6 houses' general estimation of the Kozuki organization unfavorably. In that case, I said, falling back on old memories from my first life about how to handle important pain in the ass clients, would you like a tour of Shinjuku? I can't say that we have a great deal worth seeing, and certainly nothing that could compare to your own lovely city, but if I can assist your fact-finding trip, I would be happy to guide you myself. This time, all 4 of the men lining the walls shifted uneasily, and I felt a twinge of sympathy for their obvious distress. The last thing the Kyoto House personnel wanted was for their principal to just go strolling through the crowded streets of Shinjuku along an unsecured route. It was a security nightmare, especially considering the number of weapons and people accustomed to violence contained within the ghetto's walls. For the Internal Affairs Force men, I was sure they were both concerned about my personal security and leery of allowing outsiders to poke and pry into our efforts to rebuild Shinjuku as a fortress. I crushed that sympathetic impulse relentlessly. Impressing Kagaya is of tantamount importance, the only thing more important is keeping her safe from harm. While keeping her in a locked room would be second only to kicking her out of the ghetto as far as fulfilling the second condition goes, it would constitute a failure of the first condition. Both security teams will just have to suck it up and do their jobs despite the unreasonable demands. Well. And the wheedling tone was predictably back. I mean, I am sure it would be lovely to explore your city, but it's simply too hot for a fair maiden such as I to venture out at the moment. So why don't I just stay in here with you, Miss Tanya? Kagaya smiled like the sly child she was, clearly accustomed to wielding her childishness as a mace whenever it was convenient for her. I smiled back, for lack of anything else to do. It was galling how little control I had over this conversation. Yet, for all that Kagaya was obviously directing this dialogue towards some end, she was still acting cagily, her eyes flickering to the 2 suits standing by the wall. Clearly, the girl from Kyoto wanted something, and only the presence of her guards, perhaps more accurately described as her minders, and her own sense of propriety was stopping her from voicing her demands. Equally clearly, I would have to be the one to figure out what those demands were and meet them, were I to bring this meeting to anything like a satisfactory close. Well, that suits me, I said, giving conversational ground before her with a smile I hoped was graceful. I'm not really a fan of going out into the heat of the day myself, not if I can avoid it. But, I eyed the sweet stray, all but stripped of its load. I'm not sure what insight you'll be able to glean about the Benevolent Association or the area it administers from here, especially since I seem to be out of cookies to feed you. She giggled at that, a disarming gesture that made me want to smile along with her. This girl is an obvious politician, I thought from the reservoir of cool reserve behind my pasted-on smile. I know that she's actively manipulating me towards some end, and yet I still feel the impulse to do whatever I can to make her smile. She must be some favored daughter or niece of one of the houses, wanting for nothing and spoon-fed politics and manipulation from childhood. Oh, Kagaya said, smiling fondly at me from across the table, I think I can get plenty of insight into your organization from right here, Miss Tanya. She sipped her tea, smiling with a delight that was surely feigned, considering the fact that the tea was just the bagged stuff the Britannians used, instead of the loose leaves or matcha a scion of the traditional Kyoto elite would prefer. So, why don't you tell me about yourself, Miss Commander Hajime Tanya? She has, I realized, something like the same charisma that Naoto has. Some benefit of an aristocratic background? But Naoto didn't have an aristocratic childhood, as he was a bastard officially unrecognized by his father, and he stayed in Japan with his mother. Maybe it's just the confidence that comes with knowing you are born into a powerful family, then? She doesn't have the same raw magnetism, but she's spent a long time honing what advantages she has. Well, I began, my eyes glued to Kagaya's features, hunting for any minuscule facial movements that might give me some insight into what, exactly, she was fishing for. You already know my mother's family name, because I carry it as well. My mother was Hajime Aika, and she... I paused, remembering Kagaya's age. She might have 2 years on me, but definitely not 3. She did as circumstances forced her to preserve both our lives, I continued. I never knew my father, except that my mother claimed he was a Britannian sailor. Don't worry about censoring yourself, Miss Tanya, Kagaya butted in, and I realized that the flush of interest was mixed with well-hidden irritation. I shouldn't really need to tell you, of all people, but being of a young age and of the fairer sex doesn't mean that I can't handle ugly truths. So, I thought, turning that little outburst over in my mind, that's part of what she's looking for. She hates being treated as a child, despite her willingness to use her child status to her own advantage. But, I shouldn't need to tell you, Interesting. If I'm correct, that might partially explain why she's here taking up my afternoon. Fine, I snapped, letting my control slip just a little bit for added verisimilitude. If she wanted to know me and wanted an unvarnished true version, I would be happy to cater to her desires. It wouldn't require any lying, just emphasizing a different part of my life story than what I'd usually prioritize in introductions. Let's start again, then. My mother, Hajime Aika, was a prostitute before and after the conquest, selling herself to make ends meet and keep me fed and in school. My father was a worthless Britannian merchant sailor who hopefully died years ago. When the Britannians came, our lives went from bad to worse. I was forced out of school and we were both forced from our homes and into Shinjuku ghetto before the walls around it were even completed. Kagaya's attention was almost palpable, her eyes rapt and locked onto mine. For a moment, I almost let myself fall into the verdant green of her gaze. I noticed that tiny flecks of gold seemed to float on top of the green as if some mocking creator had set her superior social status and wealth into her very genes in cruel contrast to my own lowly, threadbare existence. My mother paid our rent with the only currency she had available, I continued, and usually made enough for us to both eat a meal each day. It was barely enough to keep us alive, so I decided to join the workforce as best I could. By the age of 7, I was spending the bulk of my days on the work line, trading 10 to 12 hours of hard labor for a bowl or two of thin soup and clean water. And even with those mean wages, I had to compete for those jobs with all of the other kids in Shinjuku. Of course, people being people, my hair and eyes guaranteed that I would only get work when no other alternative presented itself. A pattern that holds true to today, I thought with an internal chuckle. It wasn't funny in the least, but it said something unpleasant about my people that it had taken all of my work and sacrifices for them to overlook my mixed heritage. And even now, if they had an alternative, I am sure a fair number of the Sun Guard and most of the notables would be all too happy to dispose of me and my services. Sometimes, some foreman, soft-hearted or soft-headed, would give me an extra ration. Sometimes, some kind adult on the line would share their meal with me. Mostly, I did my best to work hard enough to justify my presence there, next to the adults, hauling away rubble and garbage and, when winter came, corpses, all for disposal. From the corner of my eye, I noticed the internal affairs force man's eyes go wide at that little revelation. My seasonal employment on the hauler crew wasn't something I mentioned very often, while the corpse disposal crews served a necessary and valuable role, transporting the dead from the streets and tenements of Shinjuku to the ghetto's dump site near the Kawadacho Gate. Nobody liked them for obvious reasons. Nobody wanted to think that their beloved would be buried in a landfill, unburned and disrespectfully interred with the garbage. I did what I had to do, I said, forcefully and entirely unapologetically. Just like my mother did what she had to do to keep us both alive. And somehow, amazingly, we both managed to remain alive until I was 11. The familiar wave of pain hit just as I had anticipated, but I still managed to keep my face stoically blank. It was one thing to tell my story to amuse some flighty noble girl in search of a taste of authenticity. It was another thing to display my private pain for a stranger's titillation. After she left, I would permit myself to feel. Until then, I was on the clock. I don't know who killed my mother, I admitted, the words cold and sour in my mouth. She often worked in the brothels frequented by Britannian soldiers, and she was beaten to death in the street outside of one of those establishments. Perhaps it was a dissatisfied customer and his squaddies. Perhaps it was just a pack of drunken thugs hunting opportunistically. It could even have been a local group of thugs, angry that she was sleeping with the enemy. I never bothered trying to find out, it didn't seem to matter. Done is done, and I doubt anybody involved in her murder remembered her face 2 days later. How about that, I thought uncharitably, eyes fixed on Kaguya's. Is that unvarnished enough for you? Enough of a glimpse at how the rest of us live to scratch your voyeuristic itch? For her part, Kaguya gave no sign that I should stop, so I obligingly continued to talk. After that, I was lucky enough to fall in with Kozuki Naoto and Kaname Oki. At first, Mr. Kozuki wanted to find some other place for me to go, afraid that I would be caught up in their private war against Britannia, but I convinced him to reconsider. How? I blinked at Kaguya's sudden interruption. How did you manage to convince them to let you stay? How did you convince them to take you seriously? Ah, I thought, so that's what you're after, is it, Lady Kaguya? I felt like a fool for going into such depth about my childhood. Clearly, it had all rolled off the young mistress's back, the information irrelevant for her purposes. She wanted respect, and, seeing that I was held in high regard by my friends and associates, wanted to learn my secret. Fine. If that's what the lady wants, that's what she'll get. It was a difficult process, I admitted, leaning back in my chair and feigning relaxation. My first step was convincing them to not just kick me back out onto the street, or worse, killing me as a suspected Britannian spy. Not, I raised a hand, cutting off the shocked interruption. I could tell Kaguya was on the cusp of vocalizing, that they would have. But I didn't know that, I was not in exactly a trusting frame of mind. Life is cheap in Shinjuku, and who would mourn another orphan gone missing, or some Richard Hafu found the next morning by the haulers making their rounds? So, I had to convince them not to kill me. I really have been in need of someone to talk to, I mused. What with Callan and Ogi elsewhere and Naoto currently disinterested in a heart-to-heart, it's been a while since I had the chance to speak to someone who wasn't a subordinate of mine in some way. That said, Lady Kaguya might be a potential ally, perhaps, but she's certainly not a friend. So, not too much frankness. They thought I was Britannian at first, and that was the first thing I needed to change. I'm Japanese, just as much as anyone else in Shinjuku, and I would be damned if I was mistaken for a Brit. I said as much and swore loyalty to Japan. And in that moment, I knew it was true. It hadn't just been an act of chance that I ended up an orphan in a stranger's apartment. There had been a purpose after all, because I had come to fight for their cause if they would have me. I smiled, nostalgia momentarily taking away the bitterness of dredging up old memories even as I obscured my motives in a fresh layer of deceit. I was, after all, still making a sales pitch, no need for her to learn what my true thoughts had been back then. Of course, I laughed with forced casualness, as if I were some old man spinning a yarn involving some anecdote from the misty past. I immediately ruined my defiant pitch by breaking down and crying. In retrospect, even if either of them was the kind of man who was willing to kill a child, that definitely put an end to any thoughts along that line. Especially when Naoto hugged me. Naoto. For a moment, I smelled the old leather of his jacket and felt his warm arms around my shoulders, pulling me into his chest as I wept. Will you ever forgive me, Naoto? But, I did what I thought I had to do. I knew there would be a price, but... So, that's how I found my way to both a new home and, more importantly, a new reason to live. Before, I had worked as hard as I could to keep myself alive and to lift as much of my mother's burden from her shoulders as I could. Now I had a new family, a family of rebels, fighting for the freedom of our people. I smiled self-deprecatingly as I spread my arms in a hopeless shrug, inspired by half-remembered TV broadcasts of politicians playing to the crowd. What else could I do? I set myself to learning how I could help advance the cause. But you were just 11, Kaguya objected, her voice surprisingly soft, lacking any trace of the demanding noble. How could they possibly have let you join their fight, especially if they were of the moral caliber you ascribed to them? How could you have possibly convinced them to let you join in earnest? I shrugged. As I said, it was a difficult process. I think they decided to keep me on as a charity case, perhaps with some idea of treating me as a mascot or whatnot. That got me a foot in the door, so to speak. Or to put it differently, Kaguya said in a thoughtful tone, you played upon their perception of you as a child in need of protection until they brought you in close to their confidences. But then what? How did you take the next step into becoming their leader? Well, I replied, slightly uncomfortable at how Kaguya had characterized my actions. To start with, that wasn't the next step. The next step was proving that I could haul my own weight, just like I had back when I was on the work cruise. I had picked up enough survival skills while living in Shinjuku to prove I could hold my own, and at the first chance they gave me, I demonstrated those skills. Not entirely true, but there's no need to bring up any inconvenient past lives or other unnecessary complications. And then, I leaned forwards in my chair towards Kaguya, then I took the initiative. There was a gang that had been giving the organization some trouble. I saw an opportunity while out on reconnaissance, and turned a simple scouting into opportunity. I smiled at the Kyoto House member, giving her just a small glimpse into how I had felt that night. Some gang members were loading a vehicle with items. I don't remember what it was now, weapons or drugs, something like that. I slipped into a blind spot and ambushed them while they were driving off. The first sign those poor bastards got that they'd picked up a passenger with their cargo was when I split them open and for a moment, leaning so far over the table that I was almost touching noses with Kaguya, I was back there in that truck cab. That hapless pair of gangsters had been my first kills in this life, and the smell of their bowels opening in death mixed with the blood soaking my arm to the shoulder had been a ticket back to the trenches west of Kaiserslautern. After years spent in toil, in keeping my head down and avoiding any attention, it had been such a return to form, a return to when I was strong and respected. It had been intoxicating. Then, I was back in the present, noticing how both of Kaguya's security were on the brink of reaching for their concealed weapons, how Kaguya's eyes were wide and dilated with emotion, although to her credit she hadn't recoiled away from me. Well, in any case. I coughed a bit awkwardly as I slowly sat back down in my chair, the tension in the room dissipating almost all the way back to where it had been moments before. Afterwards, we drove that truck to our own safe house and claimed its cargo for our own. And then the others cleaned the mess out of the cab, as I was pretty much falling asleep on my feet. After that, I said, speaking in a deliberately nonchalant manner, as if I hadn't lost myself in remembered emotion for a moment, I no longer had any worries about not being taken seriously. The key, Lady Kaguya, was proving my competency in an undeniable manner. Of course, I added, after that, I had to prove that I was something other than just a lunatic, someone capable of planning, capable of managing details beyond the simplicity of slaughtering our enemies. That took longer, but I had bought adequate breathing space to build that reputation. I understand. Kaguya's voice was even and seemingly entirely unruffled, despite my little act out. Reluctantly, my respect for her rose a degree. You built a reputation as an individual who had useful skills and the necessary will and initiative to deploy them effectively. And from there, you have simply been following that road, I dare say, proving your competence again and again, and in the process eroding any perception of yourself as a child? As my mother taught me, I replied, I am doing what I must to fulfill my goals. However, my goal is no longer just my personal survival. As long as the flag of Britannia flies over the home islands, that struggle is pointless, die now or die later. My goal is to see the sun rise over a free Japan once again. To that end, I will do as I must. If that means that I must take up arms to free my country despite the fact that I just turned 12 back in March? I shrugged. So be it. I see, Kaguya said, barely suppressing a sigh as she did so. Despite her attempt to cling to civility, her disappointment was clearly legible, her previous enthusiasm suddenly absent from her face. Clearly, she had hoped for something more, perhaps a step-by-step guide to securing her own influence and power. Well, thank you for your story, Miss Tanya. I had heard so much about you, and I thought. You thought that if a girl who was even younger than you could assert herself as a leader in her own right, you could emulate my path to likewise establish yourself as a player in your own organization? I lifted an inquisitive eyebrow, already knowing myself to be correct before Kagaya nodded. Lady Kagaya, if I might be so bold, what are you trying to accomplish? Why are you so eager to gain power? Correct me if I'm wrong, but you are from one of the 6 families, aren't you? Surely your family will educate you and prepare you to become their agent as you mature. Kagaya let out a very unladylike snort, openly incredulous and almost smiling at my apparent display of ignorance for a moment before sobering up. Miss Danya, a ghost of Kagaya's amusement still hung in her voice, but her eyes were suddenly much older, host to a very adult cynicism. I admire your optimism, although I suspect that it may be rooted in ignorance. Perhaps so, I allowed, trying not to take offense at the comment and failing. What could this child know that I didn't after 3 lives? Enlighten me, please. I'm a woman, Kagaya said as if that explained everything. Considering the expectant pause that followed, perhaps to her it did. So am I replied reasonably, and so are almost a third of the Sun Guard at last count. My lips twitched at that, a humorless smile squirming across my face. It seems like women have a better chance of surviving here in Shinjuku, what with the gangs recruiting more heavily from the young men and the Britannians preferring, well, let's call them less lethal corrective measures with 11 women who cross them, instead of the simple bullet to the brain most men who cross them get. Right, and it was Kagaya's turn to blink with momentary surprise, momentarily put off her point. But, you don't understand, truly you don't. The people who I work with, the people who run the Oath, the people who run the 6 families, they are traditional. They are the last survivors of the old noble lines from the Empire, our empire, she clarified, the ones who became the not-so-secret masters of the Republic. Ah, I replied eloquently, finally understanding what Kagaya was saying. So, I assume you're receiving a very full and in-depth education on the intricacies of tea ceremonies, flower arranging, and how to run your husband's affairs, once you acquire one. Yes. For a moment, Kagaya almost glowed with happiness, clearly overjoyed to finally meet someone who got her point. Do you know how it feels, just being seen as an object, some investment just waiting to mature before it can be cashed in on? It's like they just see me as a bloodline and a womb on legs. My guardian and all the old men are in on it. I'm just as smart as any of them, and I'm not so stupidly tied up in all the old traditions and worries about profitability and all that rot. Indeed, I do know what it's like to be seen as an object, a vessel transporting tainted blood. The biting words, dry as a desert, sprang unbidden from my lips. I'm a Hafu, Lady Kagaya, with the bad luck to look as Britannian as one of the Emperor's spawn. Do you think that was lost on the fine people of Shinjuku? Or, for that matter, on the JLF's own Major Inoda, whom your agent put me in contact with, knowing full well that he both despises Britannians and holds women in contempt? By the time the second sentence had passed my lips, Kagaya's face had already gone ashen. She was clearly smart enough to realize how foolish and self-absorbed she sounded, complaining about being valued only for her heritage to someone whose heritage was so easily despised. On the other hand, I did know how it felt to be seen as lesser for reasons beyond my control. Further, I remembered from my first life how often traditionalists had harped on about how women should stay in their place, and that had been in a considerably more liberal Japan, one that hadn't been subjected by a foreign power governed by an absolute hereditary monarchy of all things. With that knowledge, it was difficult to hold Kagaya's hasty words against her and easy to let her off the hook. After all, she was still a child. And a child in truth, not a cuckoo with the memories of 2 lives crammed into her head. Probably. But, I waved my hand in a conciliatory fashion between us, as if I were literally trying to clear the air. I do understand, Lady Kagaya. You are clearly intelligent and driven. Just marrying you off to secure some alliance or agreement would be a foolish waste of your potential by your family. So, will you help me? Kagaya asked, her voice low and intense as she leaned forwards over the table, nearly upsetting her half-full teacup as she interrupted me yet again. Think about it, Miss Tanya. I know that old man Moonakat has been playing hardball with you, forcing concessions for every scrap of support he throws your way, even the kind of support we provide the JLF with for free. And I know you've got plans and ambitions. Did you think we hadn't heard about your evacuation program? You need support for that, right? I can be that for you. Just help me. I leaned back slightly, letting my hands relax on my chest as I met Kagaya's wide-eyed stare. So, I thought, the old man on the phone's name is Munakata, Is it? There's a Munakata on the Numbers Advisory Council, isn't there? A lord or something or another. And how did you know about that, Lady Kaguya? And don't think I didn't notice how you just slipped up and referenced we. I doubt a mere daughter would say that, even the daughter of a family head. And how, I said, not breaking eye contact, do you propose that I help you, Lady Kaguya? What leverage can I possibly call upon to help you? Not that I wouldn't help you if I could, I added, reading the thought on her face, but what can I do that would assist you? I don't see how I could possibly influence the internal politics of the 6 houses. Oh? Kaguya's eyes flashed with amusement as she settled back in her chair, once more in control of herself now that we were negotiating terms. But you already have, Miss Tanya. You see, she scooted forwards again, probably to the edge of her seat, clearly excited. By your actions, you've shaken everything up. Before you showed up, the JLF had settled into a rut, Prince Clovis was comfortable on his throne, and nothing was happening, but now. She held up a hand and started ticking off fingers. You've managed to tilt the balance of power in the JLF strongly towards the more aggressive elements. You mean Lieutenant Colonel Kusakabe, I noted, taking the opportunity to get some of my own back by interrupting Kaguya for a change. That's right, she nodded in approval. The Lieutenant Colonel managed to net all of the credit for setting Niigata on fire as well as the bulk of the recruits from that province, as well as the credit for securing a supply of nightmare parts and support materials. He's been pointing out how it took the Britannians ages to get control of Niigata again when they were just facing peasants with small arms. And that's just one of the icebergs you've thrown into the machine. I think you're mixing your metaphors, I remarked, my dry humor covering my private considerations. I remembered Inoda's news that our actions had set Lieutenant Colonel Kusakabe's star rising, but the man had clearly capitalized even further on his newfound reputation for action over the intervening months. Details. Kaguya waved an impetuous hand before an enthusiastic grin broke through her huffy mask of noble disdain. Anyway, remember how a bunch of honorary Britannian-owned businesses got smashed up and shut down after that Christmas thing your guys touched off? A whole lot of them belong to Old Man Munakata. It's kind of a double whammy for him since he's also one of the most traditionalist of the family heads, but he's the one who's supposedly responsible for supporting your organization, which is kinda radical compared to the stodgy old JLF Central Command. So now the traditionalist bloc in the 6 houses is weakened because Lord Tosei looks like he can't control his own project. That explains the seemingly personal animosity from my previous main contact with Kyoto House if that accidental riot we started destroyed some of the assets of his master. Maybe that's why I got saddled with Major Inoda. I smiled at the thought. And then I actually got a working relationship established with the Major, so instead of him killing me we both ended up benefiting against the personal inclinations of this Munakata Tosei. You've made your point, I replied, cutting in before Kaguya could drop another bombshell in my lap. As fascinating as this was, I needed to get to the meat of what Kaguya was asking for before her increasingly twitchy security detail hauled her out of the Rising Sun building by force. But none of those actions were tailored towards influencing Kyoto House. That was just an apparently happy byproduct of fulfilling other objectives. Also, I should note that I'm already stretching the Rising Sun's resources to the breaking point just to keep my people here in Shinjuku clothed and fed as it is, and that's not even mentioning how Britannia could attack us at any minute. So I repeat, what can I do to help you? Work for me instead. Kaguya's eyes gleamed with frenetic energy. I promise I'll be a better partner than Old Man Munakata. I'll give you what you ask for without making you grovel and beg. Just do what I want, attack what I want you to attack, and keep stirring the pot. That way, I can claim the credit for your successes at meetings and stuff. Munakata looks even weaker because he can't keep his own house in order, and best of all, instead of waiting around forever for the perfect time to throw Britannia back out, we can finally reclaim our land from the invaders. It was only at the last sentence that I realized I had once again fallen for Kaguya's trap, seeing only what I had expected to see and, presumably, what she had wanted me to see. I had seen the power-hungry noble, eager to find her own authority. I had seen the girl who would become a woman, looking for a way to establish some autonomy. I had missed the zealot completely. She really is just like Naoto, I observed, remembering how he had reacted to my magic, how he had all but declared a holy war when we had bombed the station. I can work with this. Moreover, If she's sincere in her willingness to actually provide what I want, when I want, I really can't refuse to work with her. With her support, feeding Shinjuku might actually become a reality. A winter without hunger, with adequate heat and medicine for the sick. Still, I had to put up some token objection, if I didn't want to look like I was being railroaded in front of Lieutenant Koichi and his man. You paint an appealing picture, Lady Kagaya, I replied politely, but, correct me if I'm wrong, wouldn't that just make the Rising Sun your private army? I'm not entirely certain if I want to simply hand over our autonomy to you. After all, we fight for a free Japan, not for your advantage and your noble intrigues. You're missing the point, Miss Tanya, Kagaya replied, dismissing my objection. I'm not a soldier or a fighter or whatever. I mean, she gestured at herself, that's pretty obvious, right? I'm not going to be bossing you around, but if I can reasonably say that you're doing what I want, well, that's just as good for my goals as actually telling you what to do. Besides, unlike some people in the 6 houses, I want what you want. I remember Japan, Miss Tanya. Your goals are mine. Just back me up when I need your support, and I'll give you my support in exchange. An alliance, then, I said aloud. An alliance between the Rising Sun Benevolent Association and? An alliance between the Kozuki Organization and the House of Sumeragi, Kagaya replied firmly. And between all of our associated groups, of course. Sumeragi Industries, Rising Sun, so on and so forth. I hesitate to ask, this late into our discussion, but... Kagaya tilted her head inquisitively, waiting for the question. But do you actually have the authority to make this agreement stand? Or am I going to need to confirm this with whoever the head of the Sumeragi family is? Well, Kagaya replied, drawing noble arrogance up around her like a cloak, for all that her grin undermined any true haughtiness. You are of course free to confirm my offer with the head of House Sumeragi. Her name is Sumeragi Kagaya. She waited for a beat before adding, you can have her number if you like, with a winking smile, the mock arrogance vanishing like mist. You're the head of House Sumeragi? I stared at the other girl, who grinned cheekily back. You are one of the 6, the oligarchs who control Kyoto House? The ones who some say are the greatest batch of traitors in the history of Japan? Yup. Kagaya chirped back in reply. Sumeragi Kagaya, also known as Lady Sophie to our Britannian friends. Pleased to make your acquaintance, I'm sure. I looked past Kagaya and locked eyes with Lieutenant Koichi. Not a word of this leaves this room, I commanded. Nobody is to know who she is. You both heard her. I met the other soldier's gaze before turning back to Koichi. She's just some middle-ranking Kyoto House member's daughter, visiting here on the lark. Lieutenant Koichi nodded, his eyes thoughtful in his mangled face. After a moment, he seemed to remember his military rank and saluted me, his subordinate quickly following suit. Lady Kagaya, I turned back to my guest, who was still smiling at me. You have a deal. Help me and I will do my best to help you in exchange. Help me keep my people alive, and I will do what I can to expand your power and influence in Kyoto House. I extended my hand across the table, suddenly remembering how the previous Kyoto House potentate I had negotiated with had ended our conversation. I awkwardly added, long live Japan, and long live the imperial family. Revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. It had borne ritual weight when I'd heard it, and I had taken it as a quirk of their organization, or of the social class their leadership stemmed from. Thanks. Kagaya chirped, taking my hand and pumping it once, twice, and 3 times. That's probably me. Anyway, pleasure doing business with you. We're gonna achieve great things together, Miss Tanya. July 4, 2016 ATB, Shinjuku Ghetto, Tokyo Settlement. 0700, 8 cars loaded with barley, and finally, no fewer than 10 cars loaded with special goods with Kyoto and Tokyo Settlement assessors' stamps already paid for and applied. The Sun Guard messenger flipped his notebook closed with a flourish, a broad smile on his face as he did so. He was clearly proud of delivering his report in good time, beating any other competing report of the new delivery to my door. Thank you, soldier, I replied, too drowsy to remember what the man's name was at the moment. In my defense, I had been asleep 5 minutes ago. I couldn't be expected to remember names before I'd had at least half a cup of coffee. Your prompt report is appreciated. That will be all. Ma'am. He fired off a truly sloppy salute and strode out of my office, the door swinging shut behind him, leaving me at my desk with my mug and the hand-delivered envelope that the conductor had passed to a Rising Sun member working as a janitor at the station when his train from Kyoto had arrived. If someone from the 6 houses wanted to kill me, I doubt they'd use ricin or any such nonsense, I reasoned as I cut the envelope open, dumping the single sheet of paper out. Dear Commander, the letter read. Hi there. I hope you like your surprise gift. Consider it my way of saying thank you for telling me your life story. It was super sad, but also really inspirational. I can see what N saw in you, and what your people saw in you. Stick with me, and we'll go far. Let's be good friends. SS, Sophie Sumeragi, I assume, I said to the empty room, wincing at how dry my voice sounded. Maybe some water before I enjoy the first coffee of the day. I looked down at the brief letter again. I was confident that the special packages that Kaguya had bribed both ends of the track into sealing without further inspection contained weapons, the weapons I would need to make the lives of any Britannians trying to force their way into Shinjuku utter hell. With those weapons and the huge shipment of food, medicine, clothes, cigarettes and other small luxuries, and toiletries I had just received the kind of material support I needed to strengthen my position in Shinjuku against the discontented notables as well as the invaders. And so the deal is fulfilled already. I stood up from the desk and walked over to the window of my office on the 2nd floor of the Rising Sun's headquarters, a few rooms down from the room I had met Kaguya in. The window squealed as I forced it open, but it rose nonetheless, letting the breeze still cool with the night into the room. The lighter flicked to life, and soon the letter was just ash. I was in Kaguya's debt, and that was an uncomfortable place to be. I had no idea how ruthless she would be as a creditor or how soon she would expect a return on her investment. And yet, no matter how ruthless she might be, Shinjuku will live for another few weeks. If that means putting myself into personal debt, then isn't that what it means to be a leader? I wonder if Naoto would be proud of me. May 16, 2016 ATB, Outpost No. 2, Shuo Ward, Tokyo Settlement. 1600. Inspector Nelson Dutra Garcia took a long pull from the paper cup of mediocre office coffee sitting on his temporary desk. The awful brew was lukewarm and a trial upon his tongue, but he needed the caffeine desperately. Anything to keep the jet-lagged exhaustion at bay for a few hours more, until he could sleep, was welcome. He sighed with boredom as he flipped through the personnel files of the supposed cream of the regiment. Garcia, better known as Gus to his friends and colleagues back at the Pleasanton Field office due to some long-forgotten incident at an office Christmas party and alternatingly called Nolito or you bastard by a string of ex-lovers across the new areas, was having a devil of a time keeping his eyes from crossing as he took in the bland details. Unfortunately, he had already cut all the corners he could with this task. Some things a man just had to handle himself, and choosing a local guide wasn't something Nelson was willing to delegate. Recommendations were all well and good, but he wouldn't be able to rely on the guide in the slightest if he didn't have at least some hand in the selection. Bureau policy called for agents abroad from their area of assignment or the homeland to use local honoraries as ciphers whenever possible, even when the agent in question had a strong command of the local language. The locals, even those who had put aside old loyalties for their new empire, would always have a better grasp on the peculiarities of the area. Even the most ardent honorary citizen who had shared every detail he thought would be useful to Britannia benefited from the half-dozen details he hadn't thought to share. From such nuances success or failure could grow in equal measure. Even if the Bureau hadn't mandated the use of honorary Britannians when possible, Nelson still would have sought out local help of his own initiative. As an honorary citizen himself, albeit one descended from latifundiarios who had seen which way the wind was blowing 4 generations ago and who had pledged their allegiance accordingly, Nelson fully appreciated the advantages that honoraries brought to the table. More to the point, he understood what drove them to work harder and take more risks than Britannian commoners. Above all else, every honorary strove to be useful. If you were useful to the right person in just the right way. Well, honorary citizens had become Britannians before, typically via the fiat of some noble potentate or highly placed governmental officer, who imparted the grand reward of citizenship as thanks for some great or long service. Failing that, it was far from unheard of for an ambitious commoner family to bring a skilled honorary into the fold via matrimony. While that honorary might never enjoy the status of full citizenship in the empire, their children would. And so, with at least 5 hours to go before he could surrender to his body's demands for sleep, Inspector Garcia forced himself to concentrate on the files in front of him, always on the quest for diligence in the execution of his duties. True to form, most of the honorary soldiers recommended to him by their officers were stolid, seemingly uninspired men. No doubt they were all strong, neat, and obedient, as only a fool would recommend the dross for duty with a bureau agent for fear of their name appearing in his report, but Nelson had little doubt that the officers would likewise only recommend their safest bets for the same reason. Their reliable men, and the handful of women, were certain to be all but oxen in human form, dull and unimaginative as they were uncomplaining. Nelson blinked and turned back to the last profile he had looked at. His eyes had filmed over with exhaustion as he had skimmed its contents and, while he couldn't remember what he had read, something had seemed off. A moment later, his eyes widened, all fatigue dropping away. It was inconceivable, an almost unimaginably stupid blunder, but... He scanned the page again, carefully searching for inconsistencies, for hints of misdirection or omission, but found nothing. Moving carefully, as if any sudden jerking motion might send the impossible document spiraling away into the ether once again, Inspector Garcia carefully entered the relevant name and rank into the pre-written standard personnel requisition and printed the completed form on bureau letterhead. A quick phone call to the staff sergeant on duty sent a messenger to the inspector's temporary office, and after a few words, back away again. The 2 military policemen whom Colonel Prescott had assigned to nursemaid him around the outpost fell into step behind him as Nelson strode past, just as he knew they would. He had worked with their brothers in arms many times before, most recently in the roundup of a ring of subversive smuggling banned literature across prefectural borders. The Redcaps had never given Inspector Garcia any cause to doubt their loyalty or willingness to dole out violence on a moment's notice. But, if the military police force had a weakness, it was a crippling lack of imagination, both in terms of investigation and in the interrogation room. Fortunately, Nelson thought, no hint of smirk showing under his habitually broad and friendly smile, the Bureau is here to provide plenty of both on their behalf. Which makes my arrival here before they realized who they had tucked behind a clerical error so serendipitous. I would hate to have seen the military police try to co-opt such a resource without breaking it. Stand by the wall at parade rest, Garcia directed as the small entourage arrived at conference room C. I need you to look as bored as possible while still looking professional. We can manage that, the MP with sergeant's stripes acknowledged with a wry smile. Least I can't fall asleep on my feet. Sure you can, Nelson continued briskly. I have faith in your abilities, Sergeant. Now, when the mark gets here, I need scary faces, but I need you to make a show of focusing on me. As soon as I give an order, jump to it. No need to ham it up, but if it looks a bit dramatic, that's fine. Building you a pedestal, eh, Inspector? The Redcap private nodded knowingly. As you say, sir. Get in place, then, Nelson said dismissively. The boy's file said that he's quite keen, so he'll probably be here soon. Remember, as soon as he gets here, you're terrifying and bored, and when I speak, professional but terrified. And, he smiled knowingly, feeling the scar pulling at his lip, I'll make sure Colonel Prescott knows how helpful you were. Right you are, sir, the sergeant agreed, before tapping his subordinate on the shoulder and leading him to the wall. For his part, Garcia artlessly arranged himself in the chair at the head of the table, striving to look as stern as possible without being unapproachably formal. First impressions mattered, after all. Especially when an asset like the son of the last Prime Minister of Japan fell into your lap. May 16, 2016 ATB, Outpost No. 2, Chuo Ward, Tokyo Settlement. 1630. Sir. Corporal Kurugi came to attention, clicking his heels as his fist thudded into his breastplate directly over his heart, the very model of military professionalism. He hoped. Corporal Kurugi, reporting as ordered. At ease, Corporal, came the disinterested reply from the officer seated at the immaculately neat desk in front of him, barren of any paperwork save for the single document said officer was theatrically perusing. Do you know why I've called you here today? There were many possible replies Corporal Kurugi could have offered up to answer that leading question, ranging from attempts to curry favor to self-incriminating confessions for crimes imagined or real. After just over a year of service under the command of Captain Collins, commanding officer of His Majesty's 32nd Honorary Legion, 1st Brigade, 3rd Regiment, 1st Battalion, he had learned better than to volunteer any of those possible answers. The battalion's commander didn't appreciate lip from the honoraries who served under him. "No sir," Corporal Kurugi said, following the script with as much enthusiasm as he could muster as he settled into parade rest. As the silence lingered just a bit too long, he elaborated with a "couldn't hazard a guess, sir." Behind the seated officer, Color Sergeant Coffin, the battalion's senior NCO, gave a minute headshake, discouraging any further additions. The sergeant's blotchy face was impassive beneath the florid blooms on his cheeks, and Corporal Kurugi fervently hoped that the man was sober. When sober, the middle-aged Britannian was the only soldier in the battalion capable of putting a check on the captain's youthful impetuosity. When drunk though, his help was dubious at best. "I called you here today to bid you farewell," Captain Collins said, looking up from the desk for the first time since Corporal Kurugi entered the office. His burgundy moustache, elaborately waxed, arched with aristocratic disdain as he deigned to make eye contact. "Farewell for now, at least. You are being detached for temporary duty as a local guide. Do thank Rockwell before you go, Corporal, he's the one who recommended you." As he spoke, the captain spun the single sheet of paper towards Corporal Kurugi and, with an elegant flick, sent it skimming across the polished mahogany surface. Instinctively, Kurugi left his position of parade rest to catch the paper as it slid off the desk. Judging by the contemptuous sneer on Collins' face, that had somehow been the wrong move. "Fail if you try and fail if you succeed," Suzuki murmured. "And all for an audience of two. How petty." "Yes sir," Corporal Kurugi responded smartly, quickly skimming the document. "I will, sir." Printed upon the document under an unfamiliar letterhead were his orders. Apparently, Corporal Kurugi was to render all due assistance to one Police Inspector Nelson Dutra Garcia, of the Pleasanton office of the Imperial Bureau of Investigation, out of New Wales, Area 7. His orders particularly emphasized his duty to provide the inspector with interpretation, translation, and local knowledge on demand, as well as handling any and all miscellaneous tasks delegated upon him. "I would hurry if I were you, Corporal," Captain Collins drawled, amusement that tried for sardonic and settled for jeering on his face. "The inspector has already arrived. He's waiting for you. Full kit, I'd say. No idea when you'll be back to trouble our halls again." 10 frantic minutes later, Corporal Kurugi was in the administrative office's lobby, greeting the Britannian duty sergeant. "Corporal Kurugi, 1st Battalion 2nd Company, reporting to a summons from Inspector Garcia. He's waiting for you in Conference Room C, Corporal," along with a couple of redcaps. The sergeant replied in the distinctive accent of Central Area 1, using the nickname of the Army's military police corps. "Bit early, aren't you? Good man. Haven't seen much of that from your lot. That'll keep 'em happy." "Thank you, Sergeant," Corporal Kurugi nodded, taking pride in the compliment even as he tried to quash his sudden spike of anger at Captain Collins. "Have a good shift." "It's always good to excel in the little things," Kurugi told himself as he made his way down the hall to Room C. "Take their spite and turn it into a step upwards. Captain Collins had his fun sending me scrambling, but I just impressed a sergeant working in the major's office thanks to him. And now I have to impress a police inspector." The door to Room C was open and unguarded, so Corporal Kurugi walked straight in, his pack still slung over his shoulders and his helmet tucked under his arm. He immediately spotted the redcaps, where the pair of military policemen waited by the far wall at parade rest, their faces flat and hard. To his eyes, they had the mien of bored men who were attending to a pointless task out of rote professionalism. Good Britannian soldiers, he decided approvingly. The seat at the head of the table was occupied by an apparent civilian in a tailored suit. Corporal Kurugi was immediately suspicious. In his experience, a civilian whom the military and especially the military police showed deference towards was likely either a noble, a representative of one of the myriad of competing intelligence agencies, or perhaps both. The quality of the man's charcoal three-piece ensemble indicated the sort of wealth established money brought, but the white scar lancing across his dusky cheek indicated a bit more of a rough-and-tumble life than Corporal Kururugi typically attached to the Britannian upper crust. After all, Suzaku remembered, Lelouch could hardly live to practice sword when he first arrived, much less knife fight. "Sir." Corporal Kururugi barked, coming to attention as he saluted the suited man. For all that he wasn't in uniform, the man's presence was enough to announce his dominance over the room. "Corporal Kururugi, reporting as ordered, sir." "Take a seat, Corporal," the inspector replied, his voice coolly melodic with an accent Corporal Kururugi had never heard before. "I will deal with you shortly." Then, as Corporal Kururugi negotiated his heavy pack down to the floor and gingerly sat down in the finely cushioned chairs, desperate to not hurt the leather upholstery, Inspector Garcia turned to the brace of policemen, who remained poised like unlovely statues save for their eyes, which had fixed on the bureau man. "Kindly pass my regards and thanks on to Colonel Prescott for me, gentlemen," Garcia began, "and reassure him that I will not forget his name when I next report in. I will, of course, be anticipating the friendly cooperation and hospitality of your counterparts in the Navy this evening. Your office will make the necessary arrangements, I am sure." "Yes, sir," came the crisp reply in two-part harmony. "Wonderful," said the inspector with a genial smile that somehow contrived to only make his words all the more menacing as he dismissed the men with a nod. "Carry on then." Corporal Kururugi could only watch in amazement as the two redcaps, cleared Britannians and hardened fighters both, almost fell over themselves to acknowledge the inspector's orders and to awkwardly mumble the requisite pleasantries as they beat a hasty retreat out and away. As the door to the conference room closed behind the MPs, the inspector stood up from his chair and stretched with a theatrical yawn, the brooding aura of potent menace immediately dissipating at the casual motion. "Finally!" Inspector Garcia exclaimed with a sudden, almost boyish burst of energy as he circled the table, stopping beside Corporal Kururugi's chair. "I thought they would never leave." "Corporal Kururugi, eh? I'm Nelson, or Inspector Garcia in public. It's very good to meet you." He extended a hand, which Corporal Kururugi shook automatically, a mechanical smile hoisted up on his face as he struggled for the correct reaction. "It's good to meet you too, sir. I hope to be of service to you." "None of that formality," Inspector Nelson insisted with a dismissive wave. "Nelson, please. I'm no military man, nor am I some Britannian blue blood who takes offense at familiarity, Corporal. In fact, I'm an honorary citizen of our glorious empire, just as you are, so there's no need to stand on ceremony." Corporal Kururugi blinked. "Sure you are," he thought dismissively, "which is why you just gave an order to a pair of Brit redcaps with the full expectation that it would be obeyed. Still, I suppose it doesn't matter who he is, all that matters is that he's in charge and I've been ordered to assist and obey him." "As you say, sir," Corporal Kururugi said agreeably. "I look forward to assisting you with your business here in Area 11. "Please, Corporal Kururugi, call me Nelson," Inspector Garcia insisted, before smiling and adding, "I am far too young and handsome to be called sir. The day people start sirring me is the day I know I have been trapped behind a desk at last." The man's smile was infectious, and Corporal Kururugi found himself automatically returning it. Whatever doubts he might have about the idea that he and Inspector Garcia were on the same social level were swiftly being eroded in the face of that apparently sincere charm. Some part of him that had been tightly clenched since Christmas had begun to relax without him noticing it. "As you say, Nelson," Corporal Kururugi replied, deadpan but with the ghost of a younger Suzaku's humor, and felt his nascent smile broaden as Nelson chuckled warmly in response. "So, sorry for asking, but you really are an honorary Britannian too? I mean," he gestured vaguely at the inspector's tailored suit, "begging your pardon, but I don't think I've seen many honoraries wearing shawls to row." "Ah, you have a good eye, Corporal," Inspector Garcia exclaimed, straightening his lapels. "And to answer your question, yes, I am an honorary citizen of the Empire." He paused, clearly anticipating some sort of reaction, but Corporal Kururugi kept quiet. What would be the point in mentioning how life for honorary Britannians in Area 11 was scarcely better than it was for their recalcitrant number cousins? Clearly, his silence had spoken loudly enough, as a hint of strain entered the older man's smile. "Ah, well. I understand that things are still quite rough here in the new areas, and in Area 11 in particular, but these things take time, Corporal. Don't worry, soon you and your fellow honorary citizens of 11 Heritage will enjoy the same quality of life as we do in the more civilized areas. Why, Area 9, new man, was only proclaimed 17 years ago, and already the honorary citizens there enjoy the same privileges as we from the old areas, if not the heartland. He's right, Kurorugi told himself, it takes time for the system to work. If I can just get my people to put down their weapons and give the Britannians some time, I'm sure they'll see the wisdom of it soon enough. Area 11 is too valuable to ever be independent, but its Sakuradite makes it too important to neglect. If the fools would stop running around and getting people caught up in dreams, surely they'd all understand it. Area 9 had a population of 15 million after they were conquered by the Britannians, Suzaku whispered from his cloister, and Japan had over 120 million citizens. Area 9 didn't offer any significant resistance after they were taken over too. I remember that from Instructor Todo's lessons. Japan hasn't known peace in a decade. If it took the Empire almost 2 decades to handle a complacent population an eighth the size of ours, how long will the 11s have to wait? That's where we come in, Kurorugi reminded himself. If our people want to fight, we should fight for the Empire, so they will understand what valuable contributions we can make. I'm certain that you're right, Inspector, Corporal Kurorugi said out loud, slamming the mental door on Suzaku. Anyway, I've been commanded to give you all the help I can offer, so how can I help you? To business, eh? Inspector Garcia returned to his chair and took his seat again. You're a keen one. I like it. Very well, Corporal, if you're going to be my native guide as well as my translator, let's see what you know. I wonder if this was all some extended trick, to see if I had any personal affinity or connections with the insurgents? Corporal Kurorugi turned the thought around in his mind for a moment, before discarding it. No, that's stupid. Why would they bother with such a convoluted plan when the Redcaps would have happily beaten a confession out of me? So, if he's not trying to entrap me, I wonder what it is he wants to hear? For starters, Inspector Garcia began, fidgeting with his cuffs for a moment and loosening his tie before leaning in over the table, eyes alight. Tell me, what do you know about Yokohama? As Corporal Kurorugi began to talk, regurgitating everything he had ever heard about the vast port city and the naval base to its south at Yokosuka, he was gratified to see that Inspector Garcia was listening to him. He was paying attention, and not just the minimal consideration of bored officers or the sullen wariness of beaten soldiers, but close attention. The inspector never looked away from him and never looked bored, but nodded attentively as Corporal Kurorugi added detail after half-remembered detail, jotting down notes on a pad every now and again. The sensation of someone voluntarily heeding his words and listening to him scratched another itch deep inside Corporal Kurorugi, inside Suzaku, just as their friendly conversation had. And over the course of the next 2 hours, he told Inspector Nelson Dutra Garcia everything he could about Yokohama, Area 11, and the fight to once and for all put an end to the intransigent number resistance in the Eastern Gem in Britannia's crown. June 22, 2016 ATB, Police Station, Funakoshiko Ward, Port Yokosuka Imperial Naval Base. 1630. Thank you very much for your time, Mr. Reisaku, Inspector Garcia said as he flipped his notebook closed. My partner and I will pay this mushroom farm you've brought to our attention a visit very soon. From his seat at the table next to Inspector Garcia, Corporal Kurorugi kept his expression blankly emotionless. There was, he reasoned, no point in giving the criminal seated across from the many cause to believe that his offenses had been forgotten or forgiven. Just because he is willing to throw his former friends under the bus to save his skin doesn't make him a law-abiding citizen again. Corporal Kurorugi felt his jaw clench at the thought and tried not to glare too openly at the informant. Transactional loyalty is no loyalty at all. Just think, the police inspector added with a friendly enthusiasm Corporal Kurorugi felt was wasted on the pathetic wretch. If we recover any of the stolen property or catch the perpetrators at their stash spot, you could be a free man again by this time next week. Asked. The informant sagged slightly. So, you won't be letting me go, then? Corporal Kurorugi glowered at the fool until he quickly added, Inspector? The corporal hadn't been brought into this interrogation to intimidate the witness. He had taken that particular responsibility on his own initiative. While he was officially in attendance as the official translator, This particular informant spoke Britannian fluently, rendering his presence redundant. All the same, Nelson claimed to value his perspective and insisted that he attend all interrogations, and dutifully Kururugi had complied. "I am afraid not," Inspector Garcia replied, shooting a quelling look at Corporal Kururugi. "While I have complete confidence in the information you have provided, I will of course need to keep you in custody until I can act on it. Way of the world, I fear." Somehow, the 11 managed to sag even further in his straight-backed chair, prompting the inspector to hastily add, "Think of it this way, if your information proves useful, your reward will come that much sooner if I know where to find you." It was difficult for Corporal Kururugi to hide his scorn at the soft-hearted display. Only his habitual deference to authority allowed him to suppress his instinctive sneer. "He's far too soft on them," the corporal thought, not for the first time. Always the soft touch. Always babying them and rarely pressuring them. And never allowing even a little bit of persuasion. And yet, he was forced to conclude, again, he gets results. And he's in charge. The middle-aged number found the temerity to look back up at the inspector. "My reward?" "What?" Inspector Garcia asked. "Did you think I would be so ingracious as to not compensate you for your time and your information beyond restoring your freedom?" Judging by the Lebanese snitch's expression of wide-eyed shock, he would have counted himself extremely lucky to leave the police station under his own power with all of his fingers unbroken. "No, my friend," Inspector Garcia continued expansively, "I will see to it that, if we recover the stolen shipment, you will be rewarded appropriately. A finder's fee is the traditional expression of gratitude for the restoration of missing property, after all." And to Corporal Kururugi's disgust, the 11 practically came to life at the mention of a monetary reward. Further details fled from the man's lips, describing hidden rooms and even offering up the address of a Britannian-owned garage that doubled as a chop shop for a local gang. Once again, he gets results through dishonorable means. Corporal Kururugi grimaced. It was galling to see what could only be described as a corruption of the system in action, and worse still to know that Inspector Garcia's bribery would almost certainly yield fruit. The results speak for themselves, but rewarding any criminal for defying the system, for reaching beyond their place. It's wrong. Over the month and week he had spent trailing after Inspector Garcia, Corporal Kururugi had seen an unfamiliar side of the Britannian justice system, a softer, more decadent side. Inspector Garcia never asked for him to administer a corrective beating to a mouthy prisoner, nor had he ever so much as threatened any of his interviewees with such measures. That had been a relief to Corporal Kururugi. Extrajudicial violence was against the law and indicated a misunderstanding of how justice should work. Of course, had the inspector ever bothered to submit the necessary paperwork for active interrogations, Corporal Kururugi wouldn't have had a problem assisting him, once approval was given. One of the earliest of the few lessons Kururugi Jinbu had taught a young Corporal Kururugi was just how effective a good beating could be when it came to convincing someone to change their behavior. So, in the spirit of helpfulness, he had even approached Nelson about it on his own initiative, offering him a copy of the form on the off chance that he was unfamiliar with the area administration's particular paperwork. The inspector had just thanked him for his offered assistance before waving the proffered form away. Instead, the inspector just talked to the men and women who he requested be hauled up from the cells. He asked for their stories, for their recommendations of good local restaurants, for what the names of their children and parents were. He put them at ease, brought smiles to their faces, and somehow parlayed those good feelings into actionable intelligence through a process that remained inexplicable to Corporal Kururugi, even though he had seen it over and over. Somehow, Inspector Garcia could just charm the details of criminal operations and the personalities of the crooks behind them out of the mouths of their imprisoned associates. Even through Corporal Kururugi's translation, which he kept completely faithful to the inspector's word and intent, the man was able to work his magic. And whenever his charm wasn't able to fully extract all the details, Inspector Garcia would resort to bribery. He never called it as such, always dressing it up as rewards or incentives, but Corporal Kururugi knew what he was seeing. And yet, Suzuku noted as he stood beside Inspector Garcia at the gate to the farm, leaning against the boundary fence as they watched the police officers lead a line of shackled numbers from the main building of the mushroom farm, he got results. Again. "Inspector?" Corporal Kururugi asked after the coffle made its way to the truck that would haul them back to the police station. "If you don't mind my curiosity, Why are you bothering yourself with all of this? Petty small-time crime? Because I'm part of His Imperial Majesty's police force, Corporal, Inspector Garcia murmured, watching as the prisoners were loaded into the armored truck one by one. It's my job to track down and detain those responsible for acts against the Empire. Yes, of course, Corporal Kurorugi agreed with a quick nod, but that's not really what I meant. I mean, you're supposed to be some sort of famous rebel hunter and an expert at dealing with bandits, but you've spent the last month here in Yokohama just going after small fry stuff. And it's not like there aren't bigger problems going on around here, work that's more fitting your talents. Seeing a trace of disappointment cross the foreign honorary Britannian's face, he hastily added, not that it isn't important to deal with petty criminals, all crime must be rigorously prosecuted, of course. It just seems like the local police should be handling this sort of thing, so you can focus on dealing with the insurgents. Oh, but I am, Inspector Garcia replied, smiling now that he had the chance to indulge himself by explaining something. So, let me ask you, Corporal. What was the stolen property that led me to this farm? One of the trucks that transports fuel out to the stations went missing, right? Corporal Kurorugi frowned, trying to remember the details. A tanker full of diesel, if I'm remembering correctly. Right, Inspector Garcia nodded. Someone slid behind the wheel and drove the truck off the yard, tank and all. And they drove it to this farm. I'm not seeing the connection to terrorism, Nelson, Corporal Kurorugi admitted, irritated by his failure. They stole some fuel. Fuel's expensive, though. They were probably going to siphon the tank off into multiple containers and sell it to their friends. Corporal Kurorugi frowned. What even uses diesel, though? Just trucks, right? Farm equipment too. But yes, the resale idea is entirely possible, Inspector Garcia acknowledged with a nod. And it's entirely possible that the tanker truck would simply be processed through the chop shop and resold once all identifying markers were removed. Perhaps the crooks running the ring would have even found the balls to sell our truck back to us. The inspector laughed at the theoretical audacity of the thieves and Corporal Kurorugi dutifully chuckled along in response. However, continued Inspector Garcia after the moment of ritual amusement passed, the other possibility is that the thieves would have sold the truck and its fuel to an insurgent group. It's even possible that some of those even now being loaded onto the wagon as we speak are actually more rebel than criminal, although that distinction is often meaningless. In which case, that truckload of diesel could be a formidable weapon, especially when combined with another ingredient this mushroom farm has in abundance. He trailed off, his tone turning the statement into a leading question, clearly testing Corporal Kurorugi's knowledge. To his immense frustration, Kurorugi still couldn't quite figure out where the inspector was headed. I'm sorry, sir. I don't understand. Nelson, Nelson. Inspector Garcia reminded him, before sighing. Not one for chemistry are you, Corporal? I wouldn't know, Corporal Kurorugi said apologetically. I never quite got that far before. Well, before things changed and my instructor went away. Inspector Garcia nodded and sighed again. This time, the exhalation sounded like it came from an older man, a man who had years stacked on his shoulders. I'm sorry, I forgot. You are just so competent, Corporal, that it's difficult to remember that you are only 15. I should still be in school, not in the military, Suzuki agreed. If only things were different. If only Lelouch had been able to somehow negotiate peace, or if Lelouch had been appointed the vice-regal governor. Actually, sir, he corrected, I'm 16 now. My birthday was a few weeks ago, on the 10th. Ah, yes, the inspector's expression grew tight across his face. My apologies, Corporal. Don't worry about it, sir, Corporal Kurorugi replied, at a loss for how else to reply. But, can you tell me what you were getting at with the diesel, though? Certainly, Corporal. Inspector Garcia favored him with another smile, commending him for his focus or perhaps simply happy with the change in topic. Simply put, the farm has an abundance of fertilizer, and in particular a stockpile of ammonium nitrate. It's already a very dangerous substance, prone to detonation when mishandled or stored incorrectly. Combined with diesel, however, the fertilizer is highly explosive. So that's why we're here, Corporal Kurorugi breathed, in awe all over again with the inspector's results. You realize that they were making a bomb here? I considered it a possibility, Inspector Garcia gently corrected. Or perhaps they were selling materials that could be used to make improvised explosives for their guerrilla friends. Fertilizer bombs are hardly a revolutionary technology, and I'm sure that many in the local insurgent groups know how to put something worrying together. If the criminals resold the truck, perhaps the insurgents would have even driven our own truck back onto the yard before flicking the switch. I understand. Corporal Kurorugi nodded along, finally getting the connections. The rebels do business with the criminals, it's how they get money, materials, and access. Sometimes, they're even the same people. By cleaning up the local criminal groups who steal from His Majesty or from regular Britannians, you're cutting off the local rebels from those citizens. That's right, Nelson grinned at him, clearly pleased. Trying to hunt down each individual insurgent is a fool's game, you'll always miss some. But, if you cut down on their ability to arm themselves and attack anything important, you can render the actual fighters practically impotent. And once you manage that, you can just start detaining everybody connected to those you picked up in the sweeps, Corporal Kurorugi continued. You can rip out the criminal networks and in the process tear the rebels out of the community. Precisely. This is so much better than the filtration camps. Corporal Kurorugi felt almost drunk on the knowledge. This was a better way. A way to deal with the malcontents that poisoned all of the good people around them without having to kill all of the civilians. Of course, Inspector Garcia is still being needlessly nice to the criminals. I'm sure they'd talk just as readily after some rigorous interrogation. It's not like anyone would care, after all. Nobody cares about criminals and rebels. My people will thank me for ridding them of such parasites. So, Corporal Kurorugi pressed, fascinated by his new discovery, is this what you are doing against the ungrateful rebels back in your own area? Back in New Wales? Deprive them of the support of the criminal element and then rolling up their social networks? At times, Inspector Garcia replied with a vague hand gesture. That's almost in the rear-view mirror these days, back at home. The work of the previous generation, of my predecessors. Most of the remaining guerrillas have been driven back into the jungle, up into the highlands and the mountains. They're still out there, squatting in the mud and the muck and the mosquitoes, but far away from the settlements, where the people who matter live. It must be nice, Suzaku said, to have all of the violence so far away from everybody's homes. To have all of the rebels separated out from the innocents. It does make the cleanup easier, whenever we do find one of their maroon communities, agreed Inspector Garcia. Sadly though, we have yet to fully push all of the violence out into the countryside. There are still plenty of criminal gangs operating in the favelas, and plenty of angry young people who go on individual rampages. They are pathetic, lashing out without any hope of truly achieving anything, but they are a persistent nuisance. I am sorry to say that we have yet to become a worthy area, like those of the homeland. Corporal Kurorugi felt a great rush of respect for the inspector. The man was a tireless warrior, striving towards a worthy goal. Despite his own people's stubbornness, he and those before him had managed to find a place within the Britannian hierarchy and had found purposes worthy of respect, even from their overlords. He wondered if he was seeing his future incarnate before him. Someday, Nelson, Corporal Kurorugi said, entirely certain in his assurance, I am sure you will make your people Britannian in every way that matters. Hopefully, Nelson responded, and hopefully, you will convince your people of the wisdom of extending their submission to Britannia into their hearts and minds. If any honorary of this area can accomplish it, I suspect it might be you, Kurorugi. At the inspector's knowing look, Corporal Kurorugi felt his heart sink all the way down to his boots. So, you know, I take it, sir? Nelson, Inspector Garcia gently reminded him, just Nelson. And of course I know. You didn't bother to change your personal name, much less your surname. It doesn't take a genius to figure out who you are. Then, Suzaku gulped, do they know? I mean, about. If they know that I'm the son of the last Prime Minister of Japan, why are they letting me walk around free? Unless, do they also know that I am the reason why the Japanese surrendered so soon? As far as I know, they do not, Inspector Garcia asserted firmly. The Britannians are many things, Corporal, but subtle is not one of them. I am fairly confident that, had they known that Kurorugi Jinbu's only son had enlisted in an honorary legion, they would be trumpeting the news from every rooftop. Suzaku couldn't help but agree. The Britannians were anything but subtle. One only needed to look upon the ever-climbing towers of the settlement to realize that their culture was one of great dramatic gestures and flashy exhortations to conquer new domains. But how can they not know? He hated how plaintive the question sounded, but he had lived under the shadow of this particular sword for almost a year and a half, since his enlistment. Every day, he had dreaded discovery just as he had secretly longed for it. I mean, he continued, I've never hidden my background, not really. I just never really brought it up. How can they not know who I am? I put my name down on the form when I took up the oath. It's quite simple, Corporal, Inspector Garcia sighed. They misspelled your name. Someone misspelled your name in the official files when they were entering the data from your enlistment papers, and nobody has noticed the error as of yet. That's... Corporal Kurugi didn't know quite how to respond to such a mundane explanation. That was it? That was all? He raged in the confines of his head. Weeks and months of wondering when the axe would fall, when the dis would haul me away, and I never had to worry because of a random clerical error. A shudder passed through him as Suzaku suddenly realized that the day of his discovery had, in fact, finally come. After all, no matter how pleasant Inspector Garcia was, no matter how willing to answer questions and explain himself Nelson could be, he was still a police officer. Are you going to tell them? Suzaku didn't know what answer he was hoping to hear. About who my father was? I think you're a good soldier, Corporal Kurugi, Nelson said after a moment of silent contemplation, and I think that you will do great things for the Empire. I don't think that depriving the Empire of a good soldier out of a fit of unjustified paranoia serves His Majesty's interests. And besides, he smiled, who am I to second-guess the fine employees of the local administration? I should protest against this, Corporal Kurugi knew. Purposefully hiding a fugitive from the security services is a crime, and even though I don't know if I was ever listed as a fugitive, if Dis or any of the other spooks knew I was still alive, surely they would want me. I should turn myself in, now that I know they aren't aware of me. But what about the plan? Suzaku asked. If I get taken away or killed by the police, I won't be able to help my people build enough strength and respect to find security within the system. We will never be anything more than disposable, second-class citizens. My father was the one who doomed Japan, so don't I have a responsibility to give my people the best lives possible? And besides, his inner voice added, my orders told me to do whatever Inspector Garcia decided. He's decided to conceal my identity, so who am I to go against him? Thank you, Inspector Garcia, Corporal Kurugi finally got out. I'll keep your words in mind. I'm sure you will, Corporal, Inspector Garcia said with a nod, turning back to the farm, where a second team of police officers was inventorying the contents of the storage sheds and outbuildings. In fact, before the inspector could finish his thought, he was cut off by the shrill wailing of his phone, a sound that Corporal Kurugi had come to detest over the last 5 weeks. When he had asked Inspector Garcia why he had chosen such an offensive ringtone, the 7 honorary had explained that he'd wanted a ringtone that was utterly impossible to ignore. The annoyance, it appeared, was both shared and entirely intentional. Ah, duty calls, Nelson quipped as he slid the phone open and put the mobile to his ear. Inspector Garcia here. The other half of the conversation was almost inaudible to Corporal Kurugi, but the news conveyed by the urgent murmurs was clearly dire. All sense of levity fled from Inspector Garcia, and it was very clearly Inspector Garcia once again, no longer Nelson. At 605 Cartwright? Inspector Garcia confirmed, turning on his heel and beckoning to Corporal Kurugi as he started to briskly walk back to the car they had borrowed from the Navy's motor pool. Fine. Tell whoever gets there first to set up a perimeter and to keep everybody there. Honoraries, numbers, Britannians, whoever, we need witness statements, and I don't care what else they had planned for the evening. Further inaudible murmurs issued from the phone as Corporal Kurugi clambered into the driver's seat. Inspector Garcia circling around to the passenger side door. If he can find a tarp or some sheeting, he can cover the body. If he thinks it will help keep the civilians calm, Inspector Garcia allowed, clearly in response to some query. Otherwise, no. Nobody should touch the body. Don't let the medics haul it away, she's already dead, there's no point. Corporal Kurugi turned the key and the car's electric motor hummed to life. Fine, Inspector Garcia said, I'll be there in. He covered the phone speaker. How long will it take to get to the intersection of Cartwright and Margaret? It's just south of the main gate. 20 minutes, Corporal Kurorugi replied immediately, easing the car onto the road, assuming traffic's not too bad. Throw on the sirens, Inspector Garcia directed, before uncovering the phone. I'll be there in 15 minutes. Don't let anybody leave, don't let anybody touch the body or anything around it. And tell whoever takes charge of the scene to get everybody inside, preferably behind a thick wall. Garcia out. The phone slid shut with a clack, and Inspector Garcia sagged back into his chair. From the corner of his eye, Corporal Kurorugi saw him run a hand along the scar puckering his cheek, a gesture he had learned the older man used as a soothing motion when he was stressed. After a quiet moment, the police inspector collected himself and sat upright in the passenger seat. Well, he sighed, it seems like our mysterious sniper is back at it again. Damn them, Corporal Kurorugi muttered, his good mood rapidly descending into black anger. I guess it was too much to hope that they'd been swept up with the gangs or whatever. Too much to hope for indeed, Inspector Garcia agreed with bleak humor. Personally, I doubt that our friend the sniper has any association with the gangs. Everything about the attack screams lone gunman, except for his ability to flee the scene without anybody even noticing their departure. The killings had begun a week before the inspector had arrived in Yokohama with Corporal Kurorugi in tow. Despite a total lack of any suspects or leads, it was a practical certainty that the same person or group was behind all of the murders to date. Each had been carried out with a high-powered rifle with sufficient strength to punch cleanly through the victim and often the wall behind them, and each victim had seemingly been shot at great range, judging by the complete lack of any sightings of the shooter. They're coming closer and closer together, Corporal Kurorugi remarked as the car skidded around a corner, siren blaring, channeling his frustration through the pedal under his boot. At first it was once a week, but the last one was only 3 days ago. The cooldown time is shortening, nodded Inspector Garcia. Although it's probably too early to guess why. Perhaps they want more blood, perhaps they have a quota they need to hit before a certain time. Maybe they're just frustrated with the lack of any significant reaction on our part. They're not the only ones, Corporal Kurorugi groused. While he was well aware that Inspector Garcia had been alluding to the media blackout regarding the sniper attacks, or what the police had taken to calling the Yokohama sniper attacks, he was more frustrated by the lack of any retaliation. But who would we be retaliating against? The thought was just as galling now as it had ever been, but the point remained. There was no sign that the local numbers were concealing the elusive marksman in their ghettos, nor had any of the informers among the ranks of the honorary Britannians overheard any gossip about any disgruntled janitors getting their hands on a rifle or whatever. And if the DIS or the EB have any Britannians under suspicion, they're not telling us anything about it. Have patience, Corporal, Inspector Garcia said encouragingly. Sooner or later, they will slip up. Someone will see something or they will get sloppy, and then it will only be a matter of time before justice is served. You're right, Inspector, Corporal Kurorugi acknowledged, but how many innocent people will they kill before that happens? And, Suzaku added, how many of our people will pay the price when the retaliatory executions are mandated? Doesn't this terrorist understand what will happen? Don't they know what blood price the Britannians will demand? If only they would just wait for me to get the system to work for the betterment of us all, instead of this stupidity. Inspector Garcia had no response, and they drove the rest of the way to the scene of the Yokohama sniper's latest attack in silence. June 23, 2016 ATB, Police Station, Funakoshika Ward, Port Yokosuka Imperial Naval Base. 1020. On the other side of the large one-way window, Corporal Kurorugi was putting on a very credible performance of a reasonable officer willing to make a deal. It was abundantly clear, at least to Nelson Garcia, that it was not a role that came naturally to the young man. While Corporal Kurorugi had been blessed with a deceptively open face and a veneer of friendliness, he had a troubling tendency to resort to forceful coercion at the drop of a hat whenever his inflexible inner world was challenged in the slightest. But if I can convince him that simply beating down all of your challengers isn't the end-all to maintaining order, he has such potential. And Area 11 desperately needs men who are more than just hammers. Nelson sighed and returned to his own paperwork, periodically looking up to check in on the young corporal's progress. His own duties had kept him constantly busy since he had arrived in Area 11 5 weeks ago, and he couldn't spare the time to truly give the younger honorary the quality instruction he needed, so Nelson had been forced to squeeze lessons into any available scrap of time, like now. And with this Yokohama sniper business kicking off, I doubt my availability will improve in the foreseeable future. It was a deeply frustrating situation. By prioritizing Corporal Kurorugi's training as a beginner counterinsurgency specialist, Nelson would by necessity be sacrificing his own time-sensitive workload, but conversely emphasizing the backlog of old business would undercut Corporal Kurorugi's development, leaving him just as focused on short-term gains as seemingly everybody else in this cursed area. For a man who prided himself on competency and delivering quality work that could stand the test of time, both choices seemed like bad options. Which, he concluded with a sip of bitter coffee, the Yokosuka station's brew no better than that offered by the Chuo outpost, is just Area 11 in a nutshell, isn't it? In all of his time in His Majesty's service, Nelson Dutra Garcia had never had the misfortune to set foot in such a poorly administered area as Area 11. Worse, the only time he had ever encountered such poor governance before had been at the sub-prefectural level, typically when the local intendants succumbed to flattery or gifts from the counts, earls, or estate-holding barons of his intendancy. In those cases, when the usual corruption had grown into an active detriment to the function of the state, it was an easy matter of replacing the intendant. But who had the authority to remove a viceregal governor? The hint was in the name. Such men ruled with viceregal power and reigned directly in His Majesty's name. Consequently, only the Emperor or his Chancellor could remove viceroys from their offices. And considering that Area 11's viceregal governor is fifth in line to the throne and liable to throw his support behind the Chancellor, the only way His Highness will be removed is in the course of a major power struggle inside the imperial household, something the current Emperor took considerable pains to ensure would not happen given his own rise to the throne. Which meant Area 11 was stuck with the leadership of Clovis La Bretagne, the utmost source of almost all of its current woes. Profoundly frustrating didn't even begin to cover Nelson's thoughts on the matter. Every area had its problems. For example, the hinterlands of Areas 5 and 6 were ravaged by Catholic and Grakite insurgencies and by the endlessly inventive narco gangs who somehow managed to smuggle their wares into the EU, the Heartland, and even the homeland itself. Area 7 likewise had remnant papist rebels squatting among the maroon communities of the jungles, not to mention its own criminal gangs among the destitute urban number populations. Area 8 was a smuggler's paradise, and keeping order on its far-flung islands was a Sisyphean task. Areas 9, 10, and 12 had rebel movements as well. Discontented numbers backed by foreign sponsors, New Zealander and Papuan rebels backed by the nominally neutral Kingdom of Australia in Area 9, a swarm of Indo-Chinese groups taking money from the Chinese whenever they weren't launching raids into Federation territory, and the same damned Catholics in Area 12 backed by the papal wealth from the faraway EU. None of these areas had problems on the same scale as Area 11, however, and none were so crippled by deep-seated problems in the administration itself. Indeed, in Nelson's opinion, the administration was its own worst enemy. It was a baffling situation. By dint of its massive saccharide loads, Area 11 was the most important overseas possession in the Britannian Empire, the gem in the crown of the new areas. Its proximity to both of the other great powers should have only accentuated the importance of good administration in the face of the circling Chinese and Europeans. Perhaps it was that natural prosperity and proximity to the corrupting factor of foreigners, far from the eyes of Pendragon, that had attracted the worst of Britannia to the area? Ideologues, lickspittles, and the brazenly corrupt, all flourishing at the expense of every part of the area not directly involved in the saccharidite industry. In most areas, his own homeland included, the honorary citizen system was used to give the cream of the numbers, local elites and promising prospects, a stake in the empire. In Area 11, it was a cruel parody, where the newly fledged honorary Britannians were treated worse than the numbers of most other areas. In regards to the numbers themselves, the empire had historically worked to steadily integrate number populations into itself over time. When the crown had first flown from the Isles to the homeland, a general proclamation of emancipation in exchange for service had simultaneously replenished the depleted ranks of the royal army and had broken the back of the rival power bloc of the planter aristocracy. Then, The Empire had set to the task of rooting out any foes within its borders with ruthless expediency, killing entire tribes of natives to the last adult man and distributing the women and children to guardians willing to enlighten and elevate those fortunates to a Britannian level of understanding. Those early years had imparted key lessons on dealing with subjugated populations to the imperial family. Bread had to be offered as well as the stick, and stinting on either only diminished the total returns. Rebellion had to be punished harshly, as it was when the Quebecois and Acadians had risen, but cooperation had to be rewarded as well, as the Cherokee had been rewarded en masse with honorary citizenship. Which made the treatment of the 11s all the more baffling to Inspector Garcia. Herding the rump urban populations into the shattered districts and walling them off with only the most basic of services available for use as unskilled labor pools, forcing rural populations onto estate villages or into company towns, deliberately leaving the numbers uneducated and unable to participate in the economy beyond the most base level, and practicing collective punishment on a scale not seen since the end of the last Plains War against the Comanche lords. It's almost as if the viceregal governor and his advisors want the 11s to rebel. Honestly, if I were deliberately trying to set the conditions to make number rebellion all but inevitable, I'd be hard-pressed to come up with something better than the official policy of Area 11. Which, in a roundabout way, led Inspector Garcia to the matter of the so-called Yokohama sniper. So far, the sniper had claimed 7 victims, taking their first Britannian only the day before, while he and Corporal Kurugi had been out overseeing the bust at the mushroom farm. Nelson had little doubt that the death toll would be significantly higher by the time the sniper was brought down. Past experience coupled with the complete lack of any leads so far told him as much. It was a bit early in the investigation to come to conclusions, but the inspector had already begun to put together a profile based on the little evidence he had available. Until yesterday, all of the victims had been honorary Britannians, but their ages and gender had varied greatly. None of the victims had been killed by accident, each had been shot through the neck or the head. Several had been shot outside of charging stations, while 2 had been shot coming out of restaurants or stores. Of the victims, only 1 was a soldier or policeman, as one of the honorary victims had been an off-duty policeman. The sole Britannian victim had been a sailor's wife. All of the attacks had occurred in either the districts of the Yokohama settlement zone for honorary citizens, or in close proximity to Yokosuka Naval Base. The attacks took place at all hours of the day, with little preference for morning, afternoon, or evening, but so far none had taken place at night. The same rifle had been used in each attack, as far as the forensics team could determine, based on their analysis of the rounds recovered from the scene of the last 3 attacks. The sniper was apparently using either R-11M, the standard Army-designated squad marksman rifle, or a similar civilian model with the same round. Which is interesting, because an R-11M isn't exactly a small weapon, nor one built to be concealed. Anybody carrying one would be very obviously armed. Taken together, the conclusion to the report Nelson was finishing began. It is almost certain that the Yokohama sniper is an 11 or a small group of 11s engaged in an individual rampage against opportunistic targets. While a Britannian malcontent could execute a similar series of attacks on honorary citizens, motivated by similar factors as the Christmas incident, the presence of a Britannian in honorary districts populated predominantly by ethnic 11s would have been noticed. The death of Mrs. Nora Evans further reduces the chances of a Britannian culprit. And this is the reason why the numbers aren't simply hammered into submission in a well-run area, Nelson thought, looking up from the keyboard to check on Corporal Kurugi again. The subject of the interrogation was scribbling away and chatting with the corporal, apparently on friendly terms. While the subject was clearly wary, he was still freely cooperating. We want them to fear us, not hate us. When they hate us, when they feel they have nothing to lose. He glanced back over at the pile of incident reports. 6 dead honorary citizens so far and 1 dead Britannian. A paltry butcher's bill so far, compared to the only recently suppressed rural rebellion in Niigata Prefecture, but made far more ominous by its proximity to the second largest settlement in Area 11. When numbers feel like they have nothing to lose, it's only a matter of time before rebellion breaks out. Even if we do catch this sniper, 10 more will be ready to rise in his place. This isn't an isolated incident, it's a sign of the times. It was painfully clear to Inspector Nelson Garcia, Imperial Bureau of Investigation, that only through a change of leadership in the area paired with a thoroughgoing reform of its administration could a number rebellion, likely aided and abetted by dissident honorary citizens, be averted. It was equally clear that no such change would be made. So long as the purist faction held sway over Prince Clovis, no reform would come. So long as Prince Clovis backed Prince Schneisel as the next true emperor, once Prince Odysseus stepped back as everybody expected, the third prince would retain his viceroyalty. In that light, his duty was clear. The line had to be held until Prince Schneisel took the throne, until the empire got the new and vigorous emperor it deserved. As a genius and a statesman, surely the current second prince would understand the necessity for reform, and once Prince Clovis's support was no longer needed, he would clean house in Area 11. Until then, it was the duty of every loyal citizen and subject of the empire, Britannian and honorary alike, to keep the machine of state functional. Hence his own service. Hence his training of Corporal Kururugi. Hence his eagerness to bring this case and all others like it to a rapid close. The empire had to hold until the next generation could take the mantle of leadership. Repeating the destruction of the emblem of blood could not be allowed, nor could dissension in the face of the empire's many enemies, within and without. Because if the empire fractures, came the grim thought, it won't be the Britannians who see the worst of it. It will be the honorary citizens who will be caught up in the jaws of internecine war and ground to dust. Men like me, like Corporal Kururugi. If only the Britannians understood their empire as well as we do. Perhaps then they wouldn't treat it with such contempt. June 28, 2016 ATB, Royal Electric Refuel Station, Conan Ward, Yokohama Settlement. 1314. I never should have left Shinjuku. A bead of sweat rolled down Kane's cheek as the familiar, panicky refrain passed through her mind for what must have been the 40th time so far that day. She liked to think that she hadn't made many mistakes in her 20 years of life, but she had surely made up for that surplus of temperance and good sense when she had volunteered to accompany Tanaka Chihiro on her mission to Yokohama. It hadn't been a carefully considered choice. Obviously it hadn't been a considered choice in the slightest, otherwise she would have stayed back where it was relatively safe in Shinjuku. And wasn't that a crazy thing to think? But Kane had never been able to resist Chihiro's persuasion, not since she'd attended middle school with the other woman back before the conquest. For all that Chihiro had changed over the years, going from the smiley, happy-go-lucky schoolgirl Kane could barely remember to Chihiro as she was now, she had always been incredibly convincing. And when Chihiro had stormed back into the hotel, spitting nails after being sent away to Yokohama, Kane had been one of the handful to step up when her leader had asked for volunteers. The fiery passion in Chihiro's eyes had been enough for Kane to overlook the stench of moonshine on her breath, her call to spread the war against the raping Britannians beyond Shinjuku's walls enough to let her awareness of Tanaka's unpredictable rage slip from her mind at the worst possible moment. After 2 months spent in Chihiro's constant company, the shine had well and truly worn off. The drinking, once reserved for nighttime or company, had overtaken her leader, and now Chihiro was almost constantly drunk. The rage, loosely collared at the best of times, was a constant lurking menace. Away from Shinjuku and the commander's watchful eyes, Chihiro had gone feral. And she had dragged Kane and Sui, the third member of their little trio, down with her. I never should have left Shinjuku. Outside, the intersection's traffic signal flashed green, and Kane mechanically sent the stolen van, full to the brim with hidden modifications and armed militants, trundling forwards. From behind her, the sound of one of those modifications sliding open sent her heart lurching in her chest. But Kane didn't dare let her spiking adrenaline floor the accelerator or, even better yet, send her scrambling from the van entirely. Oncoming traffic be damned. Any outside observer could be a plainclothes policeman, ready to arrest any apparent honorary stepping out of line and subject their unfortunate prey to the full rigors of Britannian justice. Worse yet, any sign of disloyalty to the supine woman stretched across the floor of the van would lead to a brief yet painful existence as an object lesson about the wages of treachery. Having borne witness to several of Chihiro's previous examples, Kane almost preferred her chances in the hands of Britannia's dogs. Ahead of the van, almost at the next intersection, the familiar neon crown of a Royal Electric refuel station glowed. Even though it was far from peak hours, There were still a few cars parked at the charger stations, their ports open and their drivers idling nearby or darting inside to grab a quick snack as their batteries topped off. Behind Kane, the distinctive sound